Truth requires a living specimen, a willing volunteer, a breathing individual, someone who doesn't mind being sliced up and put back together. You are that subject here to be operated on. So lay yourself down and enjoy. The movements of my art will be as quiet as a seismograph, the needles as soft as music. But the blood will rush into your soul. Nonetheless, your soul will feast on your own blood. Today we are proud to welcome Franz Kafka, our guest surgeon, the axe to all frozen lakes. We will let ourselves be cut open by one of the sharpest instruments known to man. His story in the Penal Colony. It was nice knowing you. Greats in thought. Read, riff, rapscalionate in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Greats in thought.
It's always this moment here where I forget absolutely everything that I've read, you know. I just feel this like absolute kind of like terror, you know. And I need to like wait for it to slowly drift back into my consciousness again.
Well, let me take you on a ride a little bit first, and then we can see if the consciousness comes back. All right, I will just begin reading this passage. It's quite long, but it gives us a great introduction to the work. Franz Kafka in the Penal Colony. Okay. It is a singular apparatus, the officer said to the explorer, running his somewhat admiring eyes over the apparatus, with which he was, after all, familiar. The traveller seemed to have accepted the invitation purely out of curiosity or courtesy. The commander had asked him to attend the execution of a soldier who had been condemned to death for insubordination and for insulting a superior. There probably wasn't all that much interest in the execution, even within the penal colony. At least here in this deep, sandy valley, which was closed in by naked slopes on all sides. The only people present, aside from the officer and the traveller, were the condemned man, an obtuse person with a broad mouth and seedy hair and face, and a soldier clutching the heavy shackle with the small interconnected chains that fettered the condemned man's ankles, wrists, and neck. At any rate, the condemned man looked so dog-like and cringing that they could no doubt have let him run free over the slopes, and would have needed only to whistle him to come at the beginning of the execution. The traveller had little interest in the apparatus, and was almost visibly unconcerned as he walked up and down behind the condemned man, while the officer took care of the final adjustments, crawling underneath the apparatus, which was inserted deep into the ground, or scaling a ladder to examine the upper parts. These were chores that could have actually been left to a mechanic, but the officer performed them with great zeal, either because he was a strong supporter of this apparatus, or because there were other reasons why the job just could not have been entrusted to anyone else. "It's all set," he finally called, and climbed down the ladder. He was extremely worn out, breathed with his mouth wide open, and had 2 delicate ladies' handkerchiefs tucked in behind his uniform collar. "These uniforms must be far too heavy for the tropics," the traveller said, instead of inquiring about the apparatus as the officer had expected. "True enough," said the officer, washing his greasy, oily hands in a pail of water that stood ready. "But they represent our homeland, and we do not want to lose our homeland." "But look now at the apparatus," he promptly added, drying his hands with a towel while simultaneously motioning towards the apparatus. "Up to this point, it requires manual labor, but from now on, the apparatus works automatically." The traveller nodded and followed him. The officer, seeking to protect himself against all contingencies, then said, "Naturally, malfunctions do occur. While I hope you won't have any today, they must be reckoned with. After all, the apparatus has to keep working uninterruptedly for 12 hours. If malfunctions do occur, however, they are very minor and can be dealt with immediately. Won't you sit down? He finally asked, pulling out a cane chair from a whole pile of them, offering it to the traveler. The latter could not refuse. He now sat at the edge of a pit into which he fleetingly glanced. It wasn't very deep. On one side of the pit, the excavated soil was heaped up into an embankment. On the other side stood the apparatus. I don't know, said the officer, whether the commander has already filled you in about the apparatus. The traveler gestured vaguely. The officer could ask for nothing better, since now he could explain the apparatus himself. This apparatus, he said, grasping a crown candle and leaning against it, was invented by our former commander. I insisted in the very first tests, and I was involved in all the work until it was perfected. However, he alone deserves the credit for the invention. Have you heard about our commander? No? Well, I'm not exaggerating when I say that the entire setup of the penal colony was his achievement. By the time he died, we, his friends, already knew the colony as he had organized it was so self-contained that it would take his successor many years to change anything, even if he had had 1,000 plans in mind. And our prediction was correct. The new commander was forced to realize it. Too bad you never met the old commander. But the officer interrupted himself. I'm rattling on, and his apparatus is standing here right in front of us. It consists, as you can see, of 3 parts. Over the years, a popular nickname has been developed for each of these parts. The lower part is called the bed, the upper part, the draftman, and the middle one floating here is called the harrow. The harrow, the traveler asked. He hadn't been listening very closely. The sun was entangled all too deep in this shadeless valley. It was hard to focus one's thoughts. Thus the officer, in his tight, full-dress tunic, which was weighed down by epaulets and loaded with piping, struck him as all the more admirable, so eagerly explaining his subject, and also while speaking, applying a screwdriver to an occasional screw. The soldier appeared to be in the same frame of mind as the traveler. The chain attached to the condemned man was wound about both the soldier's wrists. His one hand was propped on his rifle, his head was drooping at the neck, and he was utterly indifferent. The traveler was not surprised, for the officer was speaking French, and presumably neither the soldier nor the condemned man understood French. It was therefore all the more striking that the condemned man nevertheless made an effort to follow the officer's explanation. With a kind of sleepy obstinacy, he kept peering at whatever the officer happened to be showing. And when the traveler now interrupted him with a question, the condemned man, just like the officer, looked at the traveler. Yes, the harrow, said the officer. The name fits. The needles are arranged like teeth in a harrow, and the whole thing is handled like a harrow, though it acts only in one place and far more skillfully. Anyhow, you'll understand it right away. The condemned man is laid out here on the bed. You see, first I want to describe the apparatus, and only then set the procedure in motion. You'll be able to follow it better. Besides, one cog in the draftsman is ground down far too much. It squeaks loudly when it's running. You can barely communicate. Unfortunately, it's hard getting spare parts here. Well, here's the bed, as I pointed out. It's fully padded with a layer of cotton. You'll soon find out why. The condemned man is put belly down on this cotton, naked of course. We have straps to tie him in, here for his hands, here for his feet, here for his neck. And here at the top of the bed, where the man, as I've said, lies face down, we have this small felt stump, which can be easily regulated so that it pushes precisely into the man's mouth. Its purpose is to prevent him from screaming and from chewing up his tongue. Naturally, he has to take in the felt. Otherwise, the neck strap will break his neck. Is this cotton? Asked the traveler, bending forward. Yes, certainly, said the officer with a smile. Feel it for yourself. He took the traveler's hand and guided it across the bed. It's a specially prepared cotton. That's why it looks so unusual. I'll get back to its purpose later on. The traveler now felt a slight interest in the apparatus. Shading his eyes with one hand to protect them from the sun, he peered up the sides of the structure. It was huge. The bed and the draftsman were of equal size and looked like two dark chests. The draftsman was installed almost 7 feet above the bed. Their corners were linked by 4 brass rods that practically radiated in the sunlight. Between the chests, the harrow shuttled on a steel band. The officer had barely noticed the traveler's earlier indifference, but he was alive to his now budding interest. That was why he broke off his explanation, to give the traveler time for undisturbed study. The condemned man imitated the traveler. Since he couldn't shade his eyes with his hand, they squinted upward uncovered. So now the man is lying here, said the traveler, leaning back in his chair and crossing his legs. Yes, said the officer, pushing his cap back slightly and running his hand over his soft face. Now listen. Both the bed and the draftman have an electric battery each. The bed needs one for itself, the draftman needs one for the harrow. Once the man is strapped tight, the bed is set in motion. It quivers in tiny, very rapid twitches, both sideways, up and down. And you must have seen similar apparatuses in sanatoriums, except that in our bed all the movements are precisely calculated. You see, they have to be meticulously geared to the motions of the harrow. But this harrow has the job of actually carrying out the judgment. Just what is the judgment? Asks the traveler. You don't even know that, said the astounding officer, then bit his lip. Please forgive me if my explanations are unsystematic. I apologize from the bottom of my heart. You see, it was the commander who used to provide the explanations, but the new commander has backed out of his ordinary obligations. Although his failure to inform such an important visitor, the traveler tried to ward off the tribute with both hands, but the officer insisted on his wording. Such an important visitor, about even the form of our judgment, is a further new development that he had some strong words on the tip of his tongue, but checking himself, merely said, I was not informed. I'm not the guilty one. Still and all, I'm the person most capable of explaining our modes of judgment, for I have on me. He patted his breast pocket, the pertinent designs hand-drawn by the former commander. The commander's own hand-drawn designs, asked the traveler. Did he wear all those hats? Was he a soldier, a judge, an engineer, a chemist, a draftsman? Yes, indeed, said the officer, nodding with a thoughtful, glassy stare. Then he scrutinized his hands. He didn't find them clean enough to touch the drawings, so he walked over to the pail and washed them again. Then he produced a small leather portfolio, saying, Our judgment does not sound severe. The commandment that the condemned man has broken is written on his body by the harrow. For instance, on this condemned man's body, the officer pointed at him. The harrow is to write, Honor thy superior. The traveler glanced casually at the man, who, when pointed at by the officer, had kept his head lowered and now seemed to be all ears, trying to catch something. But the movements of his pressed, pouting lips made it obvious that he could understand nothing. The traveler wanted to put various questions to the officer, but at the sight of the condemned man, asked only, Does he know his judgment? No, said the officer, about to continue his explanation, but the traveler broke in, He doesn't know his own judgment. No, the officer repeated, pausing for an instant as if demanding a more detailed explanation of the question. The officer then said, It will be no use informing him. He's going to experience it on his body anyway. The traveler wanted to hold his tongue, but he felt the condemned man staring at him. He seemed to be asking whether the traveler could approve of such a described procedure. That was why the traveler, who had already leaned back in his chair, now bent forward again and asked, But he does know that he has been condemned. No again, said the officer, smiling at the traveler as if expecting further bizarre revelations from him. No, said the traveler, rubbing his forehead, then the man doesn't yet know how his defense was received. He had no opportunity to defend himself, said the officer, looking sideways as if talking to himself. not caring to embarrass the traveler by telling him about these self-evident matters. He must have had an opportunity to defend himself, said the traveler, rising from his chair. The officer realized he was in danger of delaying his explanation of the apparatus for a long time, so he went over to the traveler, took him by the arm, and motioned him towards the condemned man, who, now that he was so obviously the center of attention, pulled himself up rigidly. The soldier had also yanked on the chain. "This is how things stand," said the officer. "I have been appointed judge here in the Penal Colony, despite my youth, for I assisted the former commander in all criminal matters, and I am also the person most familiar with the apparatus. The principle on which I base my decisions is, guilt is always beyond doubt. Other courts of law cannot follow this principle, for they consist of many people, and they also have higher courts over them. But this is not the case here, or at least it wasn't the case under the former commander. The new one, to be sure, has shown some desire to interfere in my court, but so far I have managed to hold him at bay, and I will keep managing to do so. You wanted an explanation of this case. It is as simple as any other case. This man was assigned to a captain as his orderly and slept outside his door. But this morning the captain brought charges against him for sleeping while on duty. You see, he has standing orders to get up at the stroke of each hour and salute outside the captain's door. Certainly not a hard task, but an important one, for he is to remain alert both as a sentry and as an orderly. Last night the captain wanted to check whether the man was performing his duty. At the stroke of 2, he opened the door and found him curled up asleep. He got his riding crop and lashed the man's face. Instead of standing up and asking his forgiveness, the man grabbed his superior's leg, shook him and yelled, "Throw away that crop or I'll eat you alive." Those are the facts of the case. The captain came to see me 1 hour ago. I wrote down his statement and then appended the judgment. Next, I had the man put in chains. It was all quite simple. Had I first summoned the man and questioned him, it would have brought nothing but confusion. He would have lied, and once I had exposed his lies, he would have piled on new lies, and so forth. But now I've got him, and I'll never let him go. So that's the end of the passage.
Fucking hell. Whilst I was listening to that, I was just like, I had like 20 ideas, I think, for every word, and therefore there was just this maelstrom of ideas that just each of which cancelled the others out, you know? Me and Luke have already talked about this. Like, we've kind of like, we've savoured the way in which like Kafka's writing is just this incredibly like precise, you know, and specific, such that each word can be weighed, you know, pondered over. And at the same time, like, because usually if you expect something to be immensely rich, you expect it to be, how should I put it, almost like tedious, you know, difficult to get through. But Kafka is incredibly like light-hearted, fleet-footed, you know, and ludic as well. Now, like, just to give a kind of kick us off, like, with well, what does that mean? Like, you know, is that some sort of like vague bit panegyric or something? But just the opening. Now, I mean, we don't know German, so we don't have a clue. But I remember listening to a translator talk about Kafka's love for certain kind of like throwaway, you know, apparently irrelevant, you know, and, you know, usually insignificant adverbial phrases like basically or practically or remarkably or evidently, you know, things like this. That in Kafka, it was always as if you could hear a crackle of laughter in every single use of this word, yeah, or like literally or something like that. Yeah. So you can imagine.
In my translation, there's actually that really sticks out.
Actually often comes up. Okay. All right. Yeah.
Yeah. Or it comes up once, and it's kind of it's strange. It seems strange to me.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
And it's very unclear. Like there's obviously like a ironic play with voice here. Who's actually like, where's the insertion of this opinion come from? Because if you say practically, you're kind of introducing a subjectivity that's then weighing. You know, like in English, practically means like nearly sometimes. You know, I was practically there. You know, I was nearly there. You know, but then every now and again in Kafka, the practically sort of comes out, you know, almost as if he means literally, you know, etymologically, practically, you know, and therefore you're being invited to pay attention to this particular word, even though it seems to be a throwaway or an insignificant word. But at other times, that's precisely the opposite of what he's doing. So you can never be sure of one single pattern. He'll be tricking you by inviting you to take a word seriously, like, when it comes down to it. Think about, what does the phrase "when it comes down to it" means? Well, it means that I'm just about to arrive at a conclusion, a definitive statement. I'm just about to settle matters once and for all. So Kafka will say, when it comes down to it, and then someone will say something that's absolutely inconclusive, or that makes them look ridiculous in their pompous attempt to bring things to a conclusion, even though the conclusion we've been left with is utterly inadequate. Now, anyway, so one of these adverbial phrases obviously links to the first line of mine and Luke's translation. Yours is like singular. What was it? Singular contraption or something?
Singular apparatus. Yeah.
Singular apparatus. Yeah. Okay. So ours is something like remarkable piece of apparatus. Now, I don't want to get too unctuous and kind of prurient about these things, but we talked about remarkable last week. Yeah. When we talked about Foucault's way of referring to Derrida's critique. Yeah. And we said that there is this kind of irony in the use of the word remarkable. Yeah, because it's precisely a word that suggests praise. When it's used in a conventional journalistic sense, it's a word that suggests, oh, this is really great. It's of a high standard. It's worthy of our attention. Whereas, if you think about the literal meaning of that word, both in its French sense as meaning we're forced to pay attention to this, or I have noticed it. To remarquer quelque chose is to notice, and in English, something is remarkable because it can be remarked upon, i.e. it produces speech, So the idea here, I think, I don't know, I'm just guessing, but my guess is that remarkable is closer to the German, yeah? And this is my little gamble. And that Kafka means this word precisely, meaning this is the sort of object that gives rise to speech, okay? This is the sort of object that it's worth talking about. This is the sort of object that, that should be the sort of centerpiece, and source of a discussion. And that's where I begin this. And I think it's an astonishing opening to a work, because usually with literature, you get this idea that the writer creates a world, okay? And he introduces his characters and he introduces a whole cosmos and a miniature society. And he kind of masterminds it from beginning to end. Whereas Kafka here introduces the writer as someone who comes second, arrives late, notices something that's worthy of comment, worthy of being talked about, worthy of being remarked upon. Of course, it is an invented contraption, and there's this parable and fairy tale element. But there's something I'm not quite getting at. But I don't know. It comes from the fact that I don't know. I've just become hypersensitive now to the etym in each word. And this word, Kafka's all about hiding the remarkable in the apparently unremarkable. Okay, we talked about this idea of the allegoric detail, in a couple of our text messages. Now, the detail is precisely something that you pass over, yeah, in an ordinary realist novel. It's it sets the scene, it describes the surroundings. It allows you to place yourself, in the midst of these characters. But in Kafka, a detail is never like that. It's never merely descriptive. It always has this extra symbolic dimension. Right? And you can see this in the lady's handkerchiefs. These are just a brilliant example of the allegoric detail. So first of all, you have this, the first introduction we get to the lady's handkerchiefs is they're in underneath the shirt of this officer, who's now sort of taken this contraption as his own, personal instrument of justice, and, object of worship. But as we go on, we find out lots more about these handkerchiefs, and they end up accumulating lots of new types of significance. For example, they've been given they were actually first given to the prisoner, okay, as a gift from these ladies, okay. And so the officer has obviously taken them off the prisoner and put them under his own collar. Now, we also know that the officer hates these ladies. He thinks of the ladies as kind of vipers and schemers, and he's kind of paranoid about them as well. He's remember when he's giving the traveler or the explorer a certain kind of advice about how to act with the commandant. And he's like, watch out for those ladies, because when you're up at the podium and you're about to make this great speech, which is going to save, this contraption, which is going to save the memory of the commandant, which is going to show to everyone that, it's still an important instrument of justice. The ladies, keep your hands, he says, on the lectern, so that the ladies can't take them and rub your fingers. And so that we get this idea that these handkerchiefs are then impregnated with these ladies, everything these ladies stand for, and this is why Kafka always has to be reread. Then you realize, but he himself also wants to be loved by these ladies in a weird way. That's why he's like put these handkerchiefs underneath his collar, as if you think about it, you put a lady's handkerchief underneath your collar, you can smell the ladies, you can smell their perfume, their body odors, they're near to you. It's almost like this kind of aromatic form of love, and there is a moment where the ladies are not actually demonized and turned into these witch-like characters, and that's when he nostalgically riffs on the other era, the epoch that's now past and gone, when the commandant was surrounded by his ladies. They were the good old days when the ladies were upright and just and dignified,
right,
not like the slags of today. There's this kind of thing. So I just think that Kafka doesn't just drop in the detail. It's always like this thing that's sculpted, in and through the text. But going back to this concept of the remarkable and the unremarkable, and the things that are not remarked on, and the things that we should remark or take notice of, they're never announced, as, pay attention to this, because Kafka, I don't know, well, maybe he doesn't know what we're going to make of them, but there's this idea that they're just left there, hiding in plain sight, and I think this. Like me and Luke have obviously spoke a lot about this stuff, but Kafka requires a special kind of active reading. You can't just, kind of sit voluptuously in this work and kind of like, sniff it up and bathe in it. Like you want to, but you can't. It also requires you to think, to put things together, to start working something out for yourself. So it is a philosophical text in the sense that, again, like, to riff on something that comes out of Foucault, in the sense that it aims to transform subjectivity, okay? And that's why the stories always take the form of these parables, where weirdly, and Jacob, you talked about like Kay or the traveller in this sense as like a camera figure, yeah? But it would be like a POV camera, You weirdly start every now and again to trespass into the subjectivity of the traveller, Every now and again, you start to trespass in the other novels into the subjectivity of Kay, and Kafka is inviting you into that place precisely where, you're in jeopardy, your soul is in danger, where if there are traps here, if there are snares, if there are tricks, you yourself may fall for them, okay? So you have to have your wits about you. You have to beware. And part of one of the things that you're taught to do is to pay attention to details in a certain way, to read them allegorically, to read them symbolically, not just to think of them as like pixels, or brushstrokes. They're not the things that constitute a mise en scène. They are part of the thinking of this work, that you're being invited to assume, take on, and carry out for yourself. And there are loads of other things we can talk about, but add these allegorical details, but that's one of them. The other one that jumps out is like the cane chairs from later on. This big pile of cane chairs. But
well, I was just going to say about this notion of remarkable, and you introduced this notion of the stem, which you called the etim, which is a very kind of interesting, spontaneous creation, to kind of I don't know, etymology, etim, the story or history of the word. And remarkable is a very interesting word in that sense if you read it in a different way.
Okay.
So if we take remark as in like to remark, and then able, we just like split the word up into two. And then precisely because there was a use of remarkable that is very ordinary and everyday. and actually it's a kind of silencing or stifling of speech. So imagine we look at something and we see it and we say, remarkable. But the very fact of us stating that this thing is remarkable robs speech, silences speech, stifles speech. It is remarkable, yet the injunction of the use of the term is that you do not speak. You know, so that's
wonderful.
You know, there's a beautiful sunset, and you say to someone beside you, remarkable. And then it almost, the word becomes a kind of like refutatory invitation. You know, it's almost like a challenge and a joust in and of itself. The word remarkable, it almost, with its kind of force, vim, vigor, you know, these are some words being Patrick in our work have been talking about recently. The word remarkable, i.e., you are able to remark upon it, but my fact of stating that it is remarkable means shut the fuck up. There's something beautiful about that, insofar as it is a kind of invitation to speak where speechlessness is like forced or implied.
Okay. There are like two ways of taking that though, yeah? And I'm not even sure. I think you're like kind of drifting between those two. One, on the one hand, there is the beautiful way of taking it, which I thought you were heading towards at the end with the new tone of voice, which is the idea that, yeah, shut the fuck up now, you know, but precisely because this is remarkable, we better work out the right way of talking about it, you know. A certain kind of silence must precede this moment of speech, precisely because this is a remarkable thing. But then you also have, and this is why I thought you were at the beginning, and maybe you've just traversed this plane, like just in and through, like thinking of different examples and illustrations, is this idea of the kind of like clumsy, lackluster use of that remarkable, where, to use like your word, the word used at the beginning was like stifle, you know, shut down, you know, suffocate, where it's like, oh, remarkable. So where are we going to go for, you know, dinner then? You know, this idea of like, you know, I've escaped from having to think about this thing in and through the use of this word remarkable. And that is like, you know, its most common usage, you know, oh, Picasso, a remarkable painter, you know, then go on then, remark upon him, you know. So this kind of like horrible, unnerving, you know, grating paradox, you know, that you're faced with whenever you meet with this weirdly, like, you know, disqualifying phrase. More like what's the other word like?
Marvelous.
Yeah.
I'm just checking.
And marvel, like, you know.
I'm just checking the German word, and it surely isn't remarkable. I don't know the German, but it's eigentümlicher is the
okay.
And in like Nordic languages, which, you know, relates to German, we also have, like, for example, like property would be also eigen, you start, but eigen refers to oneself or itself, right? Like property or properties, or what else could it be? Like egendomlig, for example, is strange, you know. So we're
singular maybe is closer. Sui generis, a thing in and of itself or something.
Yeah, and the one I get in French is like singulier, or in English it's something with peculiar, specific, strange, curious. But yeah, I don't know. You have many.
Yeah. Okay. That then makes me think more of like the relationship between the what should we call it? The officer? Yeah. Who's the guy who's like, you know, the sort of acolyte and worshipper of the commandant? In ours, he's the officer. Yeah.
Yeah, in mine as well.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got this officer's worship of the ex-commandant. You know, so you can think of it. He's always trying to put the ex-commandant almost into this like demigodal status. Yeah. He transcends the rest of humanity, and therefore he provides this object of worship and almost like kind of infinite admiration. Now, why would I bang on about that? Well, this translation in and of itself, but also because Kafka, I've like spoke about this with Luke before, but Kafka is like this really precise reader of Nietzsche. Like, he kind of loved Nietzsche, yeah, but he wanted to completely overturn Nietzsche in a very subtle way. Like, for example, Nietzsche has this line in Schopenhauer's Educator where he says something like, there was like one bridge or one way. Do not ask where does it go, just be quiet and go along it, and it's for you yourself. No one else can walk this way except you yourself. It's the bridge over the water that only you can go across. Now, if you think about Kafka's Parable of the Law that appears in the novel The Trial, when there's that character who arrived. Do you know this story, Jacob? The character who arrives at this door, okay? And this door is meant to symbolize the law, okay? And there's I'm not going to go, I can't even remember all of the details, but there's this guard who's stationed by the door. Yeah, bouncer, guard, stationed by the door, who's functioning at, who actually we don't know his function, but he's stationed by this door, as if he were guarding it, as if he were protecting it.
Yeah.
And for some reason, this guy, he badgers him with questions, asks him whether he can go through, is denied, sometimes ignored. Sometimes the guard kind of humors him by responding to his alleged, these childish questions. And after a while, the man, he said he knows the guard so well that he could even name the fleas upon his coat, And right at the end, after all this time and like arduous effort and endless interrogations and questioning, he says, to the guard, and shit, I'm going to fuck this up, but he says something to the guard like, what does he say? Like,
wait, I have the collection here. I can find it. Before the law.
Anyway, it has to do with being able to go through this door, why do you stand at this door, or blah, 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 and the final revelation at the end is when the guard tells him, that this door was only for him. Okay. And that now that he's dying, now that he's fading away, he's going to have, to shut it, once and for all, because the door now doesn't mean anything, doesn't have any purpose, it doesn't have like, any kind of like value or importance anymore, because it was just for this man. Mm-hmm. But the feeling maybe you can like fill us in with the details. The feeling that you get is not from these parables, not the one you get in Nietzsche, where you're like, oh shit, I better go along my own way then, I better find that bridge that's only for me. No, precisely because this guy in Kafka found out that the door was only for him, when he thought it was the door to the law itself. This produces a kind of grief or disappointment in him. It was only for me, then it must not have been the right place. I've wasted my life in front of a door that was only for me. So there's this moment of like, in his death throes, in his final moments, as his life is kind of petering away, he realizes that whatever the work of the last 10 years has been, rendered void, pointless, And so that you can see that Kafka is in this constant like dialogue with Nietzsche, and that his parables are meant to rival, as works of philosophy, the essays, and aphorisms of Nietzsche. Did you want to fill us in with the detail, or wait? Actually, I'll finish this one sec. So there's this in Schopenhauer's Educator. There's this other big like critique that Nietzsche makes of admiration. Okay, and he says that basically admiration is the thing that supplants thoughtfulness. Okay, it's the thing that robs us of ourselves, and he juxtaposes admiration, which he sees as a kind of idolatry, where you're sort of swallowed up by the master. Okay, where you become nothing but the master's kind of mouthpiece or deputy or assistant or sidekick, with another concept that riffs on this word imitatio. So imitatio is the means by which you arrive at your own genius in and through the genius of the master. The master, as exemplar, helps you to climb up the ladder of yourself, to your full stature and to your full height. So I feel that if you think about the Kant's idea that enlightenment is like, man's awakening from a self-imposed immaturity, a self-imposed immaturity, i.e., where he can't look after himself, where he's got this kind of like absolute dependency on others, where he becomes simply a kind of conduit, a mouthpiece for the gossip of the day. Then both Nietzsche and Kafka are these kind of like late Enlightenment figures that are trying to make sense of that state of dependency in which one finds oneself not thinking but worshipping, when you thought you were thinking, not in a relationship of like master to disciple where you're realizing your own genius, but in a kind of more pathological relationship where you're simply absorbed by the master, or neutralized by the master. Now, in this story here, it's quite clear that the officer finds himself in that pathological state, where he has, he talks about his major bliss was this moment where he was in the same position as the soldier was in now. It was his job merely to look after the condemned man, and that was enough for him. That made him feel fulfilled. That was a kind of utopic era in his life, That was the paradisial moment of his existence, when merely being a bystander or altar boy, to this ritual, what gave him this kind of eudaimonia, this kind of like exquisite happiness. And like you see it everywhere. There's a moment again where the Enlightenment is specifically mentioned, where he's riffing on all the talents of the ex-commandant, and the explorer says something to him like, well, so he combined everything in himself, did he? Yeah, he was draftsman and chemist and mechanic and mathematician, And then the officer says, yes, he was, And then after that, it's like he said, nodding assent with a glassy, remote look in his eye, So he's again stuck in this kind of hypnotized nostalgia for the master. He was everything. He was the man of the Enlightenment. And again, some of this stuff is like, taken from my conversations on Luke. So I apologize for all this trespassing, stealing, and derivations. But Luke's going to have lots to say about this idea of the commandant as the Enlightenment figure. But fundamentally, what's the officer then in all of this? Well, he's someone who's misunderstood the Enlightenment. That thinks that it's merely something to be received, to be repeated, to be executed again, not to be inherited and transfigured and built upon. If you think about Kant's idea, I'm talking too much, but if you think about Kant's idea to awaken or arise from self-imposed immaturity, that is an infinite task. Okay, but then if you think of the Enlightenment as contained within like a book like the Encyclopedia, then it's simply content or knowledge to be absorbed. So there are these two versions of the Enlightenment that are competing with each other. Enlightenment as practice, that can be like developed, honed, re-engineered and stuff. And then Enlightenment as content or knowledge, which kind of like stultifies us, fixes us in a particular epoch, which is this epoch in which the officer finds himself stranded, abandoned, left alone.
Just to make a couple of very banal scholarly points. Schopenhauer as educator, and it's funny that you brought up the association with Nietzsche. So Schopenhauer as educator by Nietzsche is actually a word-for-word translation of an Emerson essay. I think it's The American Scholar. I'm not quite sure. But yeah, there is space and room to play in there and think about this thing that you talked about in terms of master, devotion, obsession. Because the very essay that you bring up from Nietzsche's Untimely Meditations is like a kind of like almost like a ChatGPT translation.
Yeah, we talked about this before. Yeah. It's this agon and rivalry. We talked about before under the title of transfiguration, So there are obviously there are unique bits that are not in Emerson, but there are passages, like whole paragraphs, in which it's quite clear that you can map it onto whole paragraphs and passages from this Emerson text. I don't think it's not, maybe it is the American Scholar. Maybe you're right. Yeah. And then it's like, what's Nietzsche doing then? Well, he's trying to say, I love this text, this Emersonian text. Yeah. So can I translate it into my own words? The kind of words that it's put in me. Is there some kind of form of understanding whereby you can adopt the words of somebody else, yeah, but without being slavish and submissive, by making those words almost like speak on behalf of your own soul, of your own individuality. It's a very interesting thing. How do you make a quote not merely a quote or a citation, but something that rises out of you lyrically, like as if it were your very next words. You know.
Yeah, and I think also there are two links to Foucault and his work in general, which is that he does not cite, in a conventional academic way. A lot of the reason why it took so long for the lectures to be published was because they kind of searched for the citations in his notes, in the archives, he only cites when it's something that he thinks is worthy for you to read. This is something that Baudrillard brings up as well. This notion of citation. So it's like Nietzsche doesn't say, "Oh, I love Emerson." Yeah, let's have a transfiguration of Emerson's work. And this links also to the notion that we were speaking of last week, and it will become very important in our consideration of Foucault's later works after his remarkable confrontation. It's the notion of regimes of truth. And this is like a theme that he picked up in that remarkable lecture, where he just like slips in a kind of history of truth, like oh yeah. So by the way, lecture 9, I'm just gonna in 3 paragraphs summarize the whole Western tradition of truth. Kind of like drop mic, walk away. And something about what Patrick was saying spoke to me about truth as event and truth as procedure. Truth as process. And then it speaks again to this theme of admiration. Because truth as procedure is what people have become admired to without knowing or understanding the procedure of producing truth. So during the scamdemic, the spread of the COVID-19 virus, it really was a kind of like a relinquishment, and an end of science, an end of thought, an end of reasoning. Now, to give you like one uncontroversial example, the guy who invented the kind of and again we're kind of riffing here because we're speaking about denotation. So what does a vaccine mean? What does it mean to be against vaccines? Well, we have roughly 3 different kinds of what we refer to as vaccines in the sense of denotational. Now, the COVID vaccine, I think 3 out of the 4, they were not vaccines. So the conventional, traditional sense of a vaccine is a neutralized form of a virus. So, essentially they take out the active element. Then they introduce it to your system. Your system learns about, what it is, its shape, its blah, 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 blah. And so you develop immunity without having the effects of infection. Now, in COVID-19, they referred to what was called a vaccine, but in fact, it was a way of like short-circuiting science, short-circuiting testing. Now, the reason why it's uncontroversial to say this is because the man who invented what was called a vaccine was very, very much opposed to it. He is a British cardiologist, a doctor, practitioner, and he invented what is called mRNA gene therapy in the 1980s in order to try and find a solution to AIDS, which, of course, again, is kind of relevant because we're talking about Foucault, who died of AIDS. And he was strictly opposed. Now, what happened when he tried to publish his oppositions, as like a man of good repute, a man of long-standing service, a man of science, he submitted his oppositions to the Lancet, to the British Medical Journal too. Now, for anyone who knows anything that's like the process of submission, acceptance, review, it is lengthy. And he was shocked for the first time in his long and distinguished career to find that he was getting rejections within 3 days. Not 9 months, Within 3 days, they responded to him with a rejection. Why? Because his discourse contradicted that of the master. Something really brutal happened to science in COVID. And that was where all of these, previously kind of dignified institutions, they lost their spirit, they lost their soul, they lost their animus. And now they find themselves in the kind of like post-truth scenario in which we live. Because if you submitted a paper, it didn't matter its quality. If it supported the discourse of the master, then it would be passed. If it contradicted it, it would be rejected. And that was like a fundamental corruption of these institutions, and I don't think there is any going back, from there. You see it very much now with Trump and the government of Trump. It's like, what is true, what is correct? Well, it's what goes along with his feelings, his sentiments, his emotion, the independency, the originality. So I just want to read the short story Before the Law, and I just think that all of these things, they play on these things of these notions of admiration, of independence, a certain kind of frugality and contradiction. So
you want to read what?
Before the Law, which is the
little parable that I mentioned is very, very short.
Yeah.
Right.
Before the law stands a doorkeeper. A man from the country comes to this doorkeeper and asks for admission to the law. But the doorkeeper says that he cannot grant him admission now. The man reflects and asks if he will therefore be permitted to enter later. It is possible, the doorkeeper says, but not now. Since the gate to the law is open, as always, and the doorkeeper steps aside, the man bends down to look through the gate into the interior. When the doorkeeper notices this, he laughs and he says, "If you find it so tempting, then try to enter, despite my prohibition. But take note, I am powerful, and I am only the lowest doorkeeper. From room to room, however, stand doorkeepers, each one more powerful than the last. The mere sight of the third is more than even I can bear." The man from the country had not expected such difficulties. The law is, after all, meant to be accessible to everybody at all times, he thinks. But now, as he looks more closely at the doorkeeper in his fur coat, his large pointed nose and long, thin, black tartar beard, he decides that he would actually prefer to wait until he receives permission to enter. The doorkeeper gives him a stool and lets him sit to the side of the door. He sits there for days and for years. He makes many attempts to gain admission and tires the doorkeeper with his pleading. The doorkeeper often subjects him to a little questioning, asks him about his own land and much else besides. But these are indifferent questions like those posed by great gentlemen. And in the end, he always tells him that he cannot admit him yet. The man, who equipped himself with many items for his journey, uses everything, no matter how valuable it is, to bribe the doorkeeper. The latter does indeed accept everything, but also adds, "I am accepting it only so you don't think you neglected something." Throughout those many years, the man absorbs the doorkeeper almost continuously. He forgets the other doorkeepers, and this first one seems to him the only obstacle to his being admitted to the law. He curses this unlucky coincidence recklessly and loudly in the early years, and later, as he grows old, he simply mutters to himself. He becomes childish. And since he has, during his long years studying the doorkeeper, spotting the fleas in his fur collar, he asks even the fleas to help him change the doorkeeper's mind. Finally, his eyesight weakens, and he doesn't know whether it is really getting darker around him or whether his eyes are merely deceiving him. Yet he now perceives amidst the darkness a radiance which bursts out inextinguishably from the door of the law. he doesn't live much longer. Before he dies, all the experience of the whole time comes together in his mind as a question that he has not yet asked the doorkeeper. He beckons to him, for he can no longer straighten his stiffening body. The doorkeeper has to bend down low to him, for the difference in height has greatly changed to the disadvantage of the man. So, what else do you want to know? The doorkeeper asks. Well, before everyone strives towards the law, the man said, how is it that during those many years, no one except me requested for admission? The doorkeeper realizes that the man is nearing his end, and in order to reach his diminished hearing, he roars at him. Nobody else could be admitted, since this entrance was intended for you alone. I shall now go and close it.
Yeah. It's nice. That's the bit that I forgot. Tell me why more people haven't come here. That's the little setup that I forgot. It's good. I think there's lots of interesting power. I mean, I've got so many things to say. Like I keep having more things to say. Like I can't even like organise them all as they come.
Let me just pop and my lack of preparation as usual. I need to get my iron brew.
Okay, all right. But
Can
with the
return
story we just read, again, I feel like there's another one of those little tricks where Kafka kind of lodges a detail in a moment of apparent like flippancy and glibness, which is that that there is actually the doorkeeper says to him initially, you can get through this door, you can have a go, why not try, So there's this sense that he chooses not to try, okay, and then not trying to get through the door looks like begging the doorkeeper to be the one to let him in, okay. So although he's apparently engaged in this ordeal, this struggle, this wrestle with the doorkeeper, it in fact all comes in and through the fact that he doesn't actually just try to get through. He's stuck in this kind of like limbo, this non-space, this no man's land. That's, what's that word that Aristotle uses, like when you're weak-willed, akrasia. He confines himself to this limbo precisely because he chooses to forget that thing that the doorkeeper told him, that you can always try to get through. And I think this is like, I don't know, for me, it's like these little moments are fundamental because it's I don't know, I'm often get engaged in conversations, like, especially with French people, where there's this massive like overrating of the power of French bureaucracy. Okay, so French bureaucracy has this status almost as if it were run by kind of a group of gods, or is of such extreme opacity, and labyrinthine complexity that there's no point in even trying to understand it. Okay. You just kind of you have to kind of play by the rules and hope that the French bureaucracy doesn't crush you, And these are Kafka. Actually, Kafka worked whatever in the insurance firm, in the law department, and apparently was like a kind of whiz and genius at being able to solve complicated cases. So if a case was like really difficult, he was kind of like the House or the Sherlock Holmes, of his little department. And if the case was like extra difficult, they'd be like, well, get Franz on it, get Kafka involved. Because he was always the one that was able to find these little loopholes, and these little like, kind of grey areas that he could exploit. Now, if you think about that's kind of odd. If you think about Kafka as have the reputation for being, mystifier, master of the enigma, and the kind of like an uncertainty. So why then does he choose to depict precisely these characters who can't do what he was able to do, who allow themselves to get stuck in these limbos of defeatism and uncertainty, who allow themselves to play these like weird little games where they seem to be struggling and trying hard, but they know themselves that they're struggling and trying hard in the wrong way. Now, how does that link to the story we're actually reading now? But there is another, like a similar trap that that the traveler or explorer gets enmeshed in, gets inveigled by, and that is both the commandant and the officer are fighting to kind of recruit him, to their own plan and project. The commandant wants to, he's like this kind of devious figure and puppet master in the background, who's got like a sort of the mind of the evil genius in the way that he fits, you know, the explorer into his puzzle. He wants, you know, he wants something from him, you know. And then when the officer sees that the explorer has come to visit him, he thinks, well, look, I can swing him to my side, you know, I can recruit him onto my team, and I can get him to stand up in one of those conferences, you know, that are a bit like gladiatorial battles in this society, that have like the gallery of people looking on and admiring what's going on in the conference and waiting on everyone's words. I can have him as my kind of like spokesman in that context, and then I can save this contraption, you know. And the commandment is thinking like even further ahead of that, you know, trying to plant him, you know, in such a way that he comes back to the conference and speaks, you know, ill and speaks in disgust of these, like, you know, medieval torture instruments. So the point is that these strangers, these outsiders, they arrive into a context in which they're not really received as people who might be interesting in themselves. They're not received as guests, you know. They're immediately recruited and judged in accordance of their like use value, of their utility for the people that are there. Like, you know, you think about like the Gulliver's Travels thing that I talked about the other week, where you got the giant, you know, this giant man who arrives in society. He's this kind of like miracle, this marvel. And all the leaders of this society can think to do with him is to make him a postman, you know, or, you know, recruit him to go and, you know, wade out into the sea and to crush the enemy ships, you know. So they immediately reduce him to a kind of use value, you know? And the other aspect of that is that these people get tricked, they get inveigled and enmeshed in the plans of others precisely by trying to do some good, okay, but not understanding how to do this good. So you've got the explorer who wants to stand up against the injustice of this judicial process, you know. He wants to stand up against the sadism of this medieval instrument of torture. And there are these little moments where he seems to show some confidence. You know, he's like, you know, it's always a ticklish matter. This one quote, like, it's always a ticklish matter to interfere decisively in other people's affairs. You know, so Kafka is kind of bringing it up there as like the topic and theme of the piece. And later on, when the officer is slating the commander and talking about his trickery, the explorer smiles to himself, and he says the explorer had to suppress a smile. So easy then was the task he had felt to be so difficult. And what he means by that is that, oh, well, the commandant's already on my side, you know. Now, what I actually think is that the explorer is caught in a double plot by the commandant, you know. So what is the commandant's real plan? The commandant's real plan is that he thinks that the explorer will be so disgusted with this instrument of medieval torture that he will say so to the officer's face, and that the officer will kill himself, you know. So it's like the whole story, in a weird way, is constructed and created by the evil genius of the commandant, the new commandant, who sits backstage in this story, you know, and who was kind of like seen all the phases, you know, ahead of time, you know, and actually has foreseen the fact that the officer will try to woo and seduce the explorer to his side, and has foreseen the fact that the officer will resist and reject this because he knows his European ways, and that then, you know, the explorer will reject this, and then the officer will break down in despair and kill himself, you know, and then I'll have got rid of that guy, you know, and he won't be a pain in the arse anymore. So there's this, I don't know if that's true, but, you know, it's there as a possibility within the text. And it's like when we arrive into this place, we think that we're being wined and dined. We think we're being treated to this kind of exquisite hospitality. We think we're being chaperoned and taken on as a kind of like right-hand man. But actually, we're being used as a pawn with inside somebody else's plot. Like the head of English in this school, like, he's a kind of amazing example of this. Every time a new person turns up to the school, he tries to bring them under his wing, you know. He'll even take them to special rooms, yeah. He'll set them up, this new person, he'll set them up in a special room. He'll try to flatter them, he'll try to woo them, he'll try to win them over to his side. And he knows this room, you know, is like, you know, a room that he can have easy access to. And where it's a kind of like an eyrie, you know, a place that's puts this person into a kind of minimal exile as well. So he's the one who has to come round almost with the keys, open up the door and say, all right, it's time for a cigarette break now, you know. And he sort of like shows them around the school and explains stuff to them in his own way, you know, with his own like bias and twists and so on. So he precisely represents someone who is appearing to welcome you, but at the same time actually trying to, how should I put it, turn you onto his team, you know, to sort of twist your understanding of this place, to recruit you to his side. And I mean, yeah, this repeats itself in all of Kafka's stories. The castle, the beginning of the castle, is this farce in which no one knows what to do with someone who turns up as a guest. They don't know how to greet strangers, and there are all these like comic attempts at fumbling this moment where someone arrives and they have to be received. You know, Kay ends up sleeping on the floor in the bar, you know, and he's like kicked awake in the middle of the night, you know, by a deputy. And the deputy then like has a telephone conversation over the top of him and so on. You know, so Kafka depicts these worlds that are xenophobic, but in a pure, neutral way, in the sense that they cannot receive the other. They are kind of like they're in a state of terror towards the other. And so this, I mean, we'll see in Jackals and Arabs again. This theme repeats itself. The other is always recruited into the religious ritual, the cosmology, or the logic and workings of this society, but in an utterly opportunistic and rapacious way. Do you see that, Jacob?
Well, lots of things. I'm seeing many things at the moment.
Okay.
Man's got spider eyes.
No, sure. I see that you just said so many things that it was a bit difficult for.
Yeah, sorry. All right.
To focus on one thing, or at least to the thing you were talking about. Can I return us a bit? I mean, I just want to. I have kind of two bigger perspectives that would be interesting to flow. But maybe I'll just start with the first one, which I think is this idea of not knowing one's judgment, right? And then also the this kind of strange fact that, you know, the officer says, at least in my translation, you know, it would be no use informing him, he's going to experience it on his body anyway. And then this kind of I don't know, there's something very intriguing about this whole thing, I think. I mean, in the sense that it links partially into kind of sadism, of course, as a kind of that there is only the law, you know, the person, you're kind of the victim in a sense is not a, like, you know, it's barely there. They just have to kind of see this demonstration of the law, which is kind of this meticulous, precise, cold kind of execution. And then I'm also thinking about like how the law here seems so I mean, not opaque, but it's just empty. It's just kind of pure empty. It's there, but there is no kind of elaboration. There is no content in a sense, you know, like where, and it seems like unknowable also in a sense almost. Like in the sense that, okay, so there's the kind of the commandment, which is then a sentence like honor thy superior, I think it is. And then it's as if the sentence then is like, you know, there's the only way to understand it is to have it physically inscribed, like punished, you know, like physically inscribed through this punishment on your body. I don't know. I don't know. It makes me like very much think of Deleuze and Guattari in many ways, like of Inscription and like Inscription on the flesh and blah blah blah. There, I mean, many things there. But I don't know what you think of it. I found it very like it seems like this kind of central piece to me in the story. Like the fact, I mean, he doesn't speak French. And he makes the point very clear that, okay, so the condemned man doesn't speak French. And then there is this confusion about, okay, so the soldier, he says, doesn't speak French either. But then he kind of turns out to speak French towards the end, right?
Well, I mean, there are I don't know, just to reply to what you were saying, and then some thoughts that I had. Now, firstly, is there are these big kind of issues of translation, between German and English. Like a word just two immediately jump out to me from philosophical history: Schadenfreude, which I guess you all know the meaning of, and Zeitgeist. So there's something, but in the English, to be Foucauldian, let's stick to the text. There's something, and I'm not sure if it's there in the German, because it is the sentence and the sentence, right? So it's certainly there in English, So the mechanics and functioning of the law in the United Kingdom and the Anglo-Saxon world, to be a bit pithy, there are thousands of sentences, the adjudication of which results in your sentence. The period of time in which you face deprivation of your liberties, confinement, community service, whatever it is, the outcome of the deliberation. And I think that's quite interesting in relationship to Kafka, because of course what is translated into English as the trial, in German it's das Prozessus. And it's one of those things, it's a bit like with Foucault. I don't understand why they translate it in this way. I don't understand why les mots et les choses is not translated as words and things, which to me is a much better translation than the order of things. Similarly, with the trial, I don't understand why they translate it. They don't translate it as the process, but rather the trial. And I think, speaking to someone who speaks German, that in German they don't have this distinction, which then speaks to what Patrick was saying about French bureaucracy, and there are kind of worlds of thought, in here, in which I am, linguistically just completely unable to step into. I'm just noting certain, to speak of traces, to speak of inscription. I'm just noticing certain connections. So so why is Kafka's The Trial not called The Process? And there's a connection here with the word sentence. Because the word sentence in English it combines both the means, i.e., both the process and the outcome, which is something that the trial as a translation of the process does. Right, because and maybe that's why it's translated in this way. Perhaps who would know? But maybe they translate das Prozessus as the trial because the verdict is delivered from the start. Right, so the verdict being delivered from the start, the trial is over before it is completed. So maybe in English, because we have that play. And between sentence and sentence, so between process and outcome, and it's contained within the grammar of the word, sentence. So what I have just spoken is a sentence. Yet, if I were to sentence you, and then there are forms of poetic linguistic play that emerge in my mind, I don't know if Hattrick would go along with this riff. We can see, but to sentence you is not simply to cast upon you a kind of finality about which I have power. I feel that I could use poetically to sentence you in the sense of to poeticize you, to expand you, to give you a sense of yourself in the sentence that is a sentence that allows space and thought and rumination. That is not declarative.
Yeah, I think you could do it in the sense of, you could be like, I turn you into a sentence somehow, like So I sentence you means like I care enough about you to turn you into language, to riff on you or something. That's how I hear it. I can imagine a poet boasting to his lover that I sentence you, which has this criminal undertone, because the intimacy is itself bound up with the whole history of like criminality, you know, not only in criminal forms of intimacy, but, you know, in this idea that we kind of like skulk off, we abscond from duties, you know, we're not at work when we're in this moment of intimacy, that we've shunned the rest of society when we're in this moment of intimacy. So there is already this relationship between intimacy and criminality. So I think you could also expand it. I sentence you as in like, yeah, I convert you into lyrics, into words.
Just a quick one. I was also looking at like Swedish and German is the Danish also for that matter. I mean, it is similar, right? But I would be very curious, for example, in German, how commandment and commander and command is kind of all related, because they're so kind of in this text, at least in the English. But like the Swedish translation of commandment, you know, like the 10 commandments, it has nothing to do with command. Like it's literally like it's a completely different translation. So they are not connected. And to command and a commander is neither connected. I don't really know how it is in German. You can commandeer someone kind of, but that seems to, you know, I like, it's not the word you would use to I command you, you know, to do something. There's a lot of poetry in this sense in English here in the text.
Just to from a completely different and oblique angle, bring a translated Bulgarian poem. I don't know the author, but he wrote this before he was facing the firing squad, and just before I had this notion sprung into my mind, and it was Bakhtin and problems of Dostoevsky's poetics. Now, in this book by Bakhtin, Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics, he is essentially articulating a radical critique of Soviet Russia, of communism, and I think perhaps it's more clear in Rebel Elias in His World. Patrick, I just ask you to hold on, because this is the kind of thing that is your absolute profession. But what both of those books, what interests me about them is that the first kind of like 50 pages is the most like boring, redundant, like kind of, oh, and there was this person who spoke about the work in this way. Oh, and there was this person who spoke about the work in that way. And then he's kind of like, it's a premonitory to what is like a radical critique of I mean, I'm not sure if it was Stalinism, state socialism, communism. I don't even know what these words mean, to be honest. They are complex, and we will come to them. But this person, I think these two poems, they bring all of these dimensions together. And the person who shared with me these poems said that they are a very bad translation. Now, these poems were written by the man in question before he faced the firing squad for writing against the ruling powers. These poems are called On Parting to My Wife. Sometimes I'll come when you're asleep, an unexpected visitor. Don't leave me outside in the street. Don't bar the door. I'll enter quietly, softly sit and gaze upon you in the dark. Then when my eyes have gazed their fill, I'll kiss you and depart. And the second one, the fight is hard and pitiless. The fight is epic, as they say. I fell. Another takes my place. Why single out a name? After the firing squad, the worms. Thus does the simple logic go. But in the storm we'll be with you, my people, for we loved you so.
Wait, one second. Because I think I can loop back round to that thing that Luke just read. But I wanted to just go back because Jacob said something like that we kind of riffed on, but we like digress from, and that I think is like really, really interesting. And it relates to all this stuff, like, but it's about this idea of the law being non-existent, you know, the law lacking substance. Like, what the hell is the law here, you know? And I think it does relate to this fact that, you know, as Jacob said, all you've got, the whole law is just reduced down to this moment of branding, you know, this branding that's also a moment of assassination, you know, of execution. And what I think happens here, and this that builds on the stuff we said about sentencing, is that we see like language reduced to a kind of nothingness, a degree zero of language kind of completely evacuated of its entire substance. Now, Cavell has this like nice idea that he says my language is always beyond me. You know? In order to be able to speak, you have to let your words go. You know, you can't control the other person's interpretation of your words. Language only has meaning precisely because it goes from me to you. Okay, it escapes my subjectivity at some point. You know, and it requires, you know, it nests itself in your mind. You know, it's received by you. And, you know, there's so many complex things that go on here, but even in the most like banal, reduced sense, it requires you to give weight to certain words, you know, to be able to like, in some way hooks up to your interests in a particular way, blah, 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 blah. But there is this sense in which language belongs to nobody, you know, it's an excess of each individual. But here, what we've got is this language that, a sort of system of law that simply won't allow language to go, you know, won't allow language to be passed on to somebody else, but wants to use language, can only knife you with language, you know, can only kind of scar you with language, can only brand you with language. And in fact, at the point at which its sentence is finished, you're no longer even allowed to live, okay? Its sentence will not only like, you know, be received by you in its own manner of, you know, of choosing, but it will kill you at the very point at which you've understood it, you know. But even then, like understanding doesn't take place because it's just been replaced by branding, you know. And you get this very weird, like, and Jacob, I think, it's kind of like open the whole text up here with this remark, because at the beginning, at least, there's some substance to the law, okay? Because the law says that you cannot, like, insubordination, you know, this defiance of your superiors is against the law, okay? So we've got something to hang on to. But by the end, we've got that the law is kind of just like self-fulfilling, it's circular, and all it says is be just, you know? So we've got the absolute reduction of the law to this kind of void or vortex in which the guy who was carrying out the law, the guy that was supposed to be executing the law, the guy that was supposed to be making sure that the law was fulfilled, now is arraigned himself, now is sentenced for his infringement of justice itself. You know, and he has branded into him, be just, and then the law dissolves, crumbles there, you know, in the breaking down of this, like, this monstrous, you know, dragon-like machine. And there are just so many, I don't want to say anything else because I just think that there's something still here that's escaping me, like this idea that the law doesn't exist. So, and also it's like there's no process, okay? There's no moment where we consider what the meaning of the law is. There's no moment where someone is able to defend themselves, either to say I didn't actually break the law, or, you know, like I was breaking the law only because there was another law that was being broken, you know. So we get a sense of like different laws coexisting in a constellation, you know, or you know, my sentence shouldn't be so harsh because there were certain mitigating circumstances. You know, everything that usually goes to combining, making up a law. We have instead the substitution of that process, that discussion, that conversation with this kind of, I don't know, what kind of peremptory action, you know, this action from which there's no return, you know.
I mean, yeah. Just to say something while it's on my mind, you know. I don't want to go into all the kind of ins and outs and nooks and crannies of Patrick and my book about Kafka. However, he always begins his stories in this way. I mean, you know, if you think of the Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa, it's something like Gregor Samsa woke up to discover that he's a vermin. If you look at Das Processes, the trial, the people always wake up in a moment of confusion And that's what lends the interpretation that well, I mean, I think I've salvaged from Socrates and his final words, "Crito, a cock for Asclepius." And it's this notion of daybreak and dawn, and something that I learned when I was living in the rainforest. I won't go into the whole, the whole story, the blah blah blah. But firstly, nighttime is noisy. You know, like the natural state of nighttime is noise. It's full of noise, frogs and insects, and it's not at all a time of quiet. There is a time between around 3 o'clock and 5 in the morning when it becomes deathly silent. That's a really beautiful place to be. But the cock does not crow at daybreak. I used to be woke up by the cock crowing, and it was winter, and it was fucking freezing. I mean, the sweat at the time when I had not been invited to live in one of the community's huts. My sweat and perspiration have frozen on the inside of my shit tent, and I'd be woken up by this cock that would crow. And I'd be like, it's and people always associate the cock and the crowing with sunrise, with daybreak. But actually, it's not. The cock crows before sunrise and daybreak. An hour or 2 hours before. So the sun would hit me and warm me around 1.5 to 2 hours after the cocks began to crow. And I think there's something fundamental in that. Those were the last words of Socrates. Crito, a cock for Asclepius, or the god of health and well-being. Now, something in all of Kafka's stories is that there is this constant theme of daybreak. And now the daybreak, I think, is precisely this misunderstanding of the last words of Socrates. Because the day into which the person is broken, I mean, precisely, again, maybe I'm taking this riff too far and Patrick needs to slap me on the hand with a ruler. But, if you think of the processus or the trial, well, how is it? He's disturbed. He's still in his nightgown. And, you have this ridiculous scene of these people, inquiring him and demanding him questions and answers and identity. And he's ruffling through his things and he gets out like a bicycle permit, like the permit that says that I own this bicycle, and he tries to give them as like proof of his, of his existence, and this is very much like Gregor Samsa in the Metamorphosis, where he awakes into a state of a giant vermin, and it's very there's something brilliant about this. There's and something that I think Patrick maybe was commenting on. There's something deeply philosophical about Kafka. And I've made an argument before that Apocalypse Now should be considered a work of philosophy. Like I said, me and Patrick have like an incipient book, an outline, a framework about Kafka, and it certainly is philosophy. But to contrast to something else in literature, think of a Moby Dick by Melville, right? Or like Call Me Ishmael, and all of the Richter. You see, I'm even a portmanteau in myself. Richness, texture, Richter.
Richter.
Yeah, maybe we should add that to the OED. Richter. And then this is something I think that David Foster Wallace takes up. No, sorry, Hunter S. Thompson. It was on the edge of Barstow when the drugs took hold. So in a sense, he's also playing with this, So we have here like three different ways, right? We have the Kafka way, in which we are always introduced into this state of like uncertainty, of dispute, of disorder, of challenge, of problem. We have the opposite side of the spectrum in Melville. Call Me Ishmael, and then in some way. Hunter S. Thompson, it was on the edge of Barstow when the drugs took hold. I don't know that there is something to me that structurally kind of they relate to each other. Just one sec, I've got some food being delivered. I need to go and grab it. I'll be back.
Yeah, so Jacob, back to this idea of the law being emptied out, being hollowed out. Yeah, I think one idea is it's a kind of precise parody of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy can introduce any we talked before about this idea of amnesia being inherent to bureaucracy. That as soon as a regulation or a new code is introduced, it's as if it has always existed. All you're meant to do as a functionary, as a member of this bureaucratic system, is to carry out, the policy, is to execute is to abide the regulations, is to follow the code. So the bureaucracy is almost like this early stage of a kind of algorithmic system. The people are in some way beholden to, everyone within a bureaucracy is beholden to these rules, or orders, regulations, and policies. Now that can have its good side because it introduces fairness, and it means that everyone is kind of like beneath the law and subject to the law of that system. But it can also produce these kind of bizarre moments, like in recent English history, where they simply introduced a piece of legislation saying that Rwanda is safe. There was all these disputes and bickering and big arguments in the House of Commons about deportation of asylum seekers to Rwanda. So in order to cut through the debate and the discussion, the government introduced legislation saying Rwanda is safe. And that exists within law in a form similar to the way in which be just or honor thy superiors exists on the body after you've been subjected to this machine, this remarkable piece of apparatus. Did you see what I'm saying? Because it's like it eternalizes something. It's trying to make language which is something that's kind of like intangible. It's trying to make it concrete. It's trying to make language something which is always changing, permanent and fixed. Okay, changing the nature of this thing that is language, something that's elusive, absolutely known, exhaustively known, in and all the way through, upside down and inside out. The other thing that I'd say is, well, what are the people? There's a kind of psychic study of the bureaucrat himself, of the functionary. This officer guy is like one of these, small-minded functionaries or small-minded academics, who just follows the rules and, like for example, this, and because you made this other point, Jacob, about the dysfunction of the conscience, the way in which, somehow the officer becomes kind of anesthetized to the horror of this contraption, to the horror of this instrument, to the injustice of this process. Did you say something like that? No. What was the first point you made?
Can I just intervene here in a kind of point of information, factual way? That at the end of the story, the officer condemns himself to the machine, and that is the inscription. The inscription that is that we've talked a lot about. Be just is. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that it is not the inscription of the condemned man. The madman who's dribbling and then there is this kind of scene where the man who was to be condemned rather watches the officer condemn himself to the machine. So the process is kind of interrupted, and be just is the inscription of condemnation that in which the officer very explicitly commits suicide, and the machine itself commits suicide. It breaks apart, it flies all over the place. It's as it's making this inscription, be just, as it's kind of like final terminal injunction. And sorry, I just thought that was something that was interesting, important, that kind of gone away and been unremarked upon.
But well, go ahead if you want. But I was just thinking. You were saying something about the officer, Patrick, that he seems like. I can't remember exactly what you said, but it gave me the impression, that he was just kind of, someone who just executes the law and abides by the rules in a kind of normative sense. But for me, there's something like, he's so enthusiastic. He's like, goes into it so much. He's like reverent. He's devotional to this kind of old commander, right, and to the law, like seemingly, but through the commander somehow, I guess, and to the machine also, right? And then Kafka also like does all these kind of, there's these kind of spiritual things with the shining rods, and the sun is there, and there's all these kind of like observations of light, of radiance, that kind of combined with his kind of, I mean, I'm hesitant to call him a sadist, because I don't think he in a sense is, but there's a lot of traits in his kind of, so like meticulous with the process, with demonstrating like, okay, now we're going to do this and da. But I mean, then there is the actual kind of performance, or the I guess the process on the condemned man. And here somehow I think we're in a kind of different universe. We're not talking about sadism as such, but there's something there. I mean, where he kind of, there's the sadism in a sense of the law, and then there is the kind of holy spiritual element of the law as well somehow. And that this officer is like a kind of worshipper, as we were talking about earlier, right? That he's
I agree,
devoted to this thing, and kind of,
you're right, it's an eroticized obedience, you know. It's very tactile. He palpates the machine. He enjoys them, almost like this kind of like prurient fondling of the different parts and pieces of equipment and mechanisms. And what I was thinking as well is this idea of, well, this is bureaucracy as kind of ritual too, because you have this thing where he's not happy with how clean his hands are, you know, before he touches the paper or things like that, you know. Or he has this moment, and I do think there is this thing about a web, a nexus of like the academic, the bureaucrat, and this kind of worshipper, because you also have this idea, his kind of pride and feeling of superiority in his ability to interpret this strange calligraphy of the master as well. You know,
it's like a holy text, right?
Yes,
and he says scripture,
and he's like, don't you see it when it's like this? You know, he's like the only one who can read this, right? As well. Right. So it's to go back to this idea of the degree zero of language. It's an utterly private language. You almost can't be instructed in the reading of this language. It exists like solipsistically just for him. But you've also got this like scholarly territorialism. This is my territory. And when the guy doesn't understand it, I think there's this line where he's like, he smiled at him as like an old man smiles at childish nonsense, but pursues his own meditations at the same time, you know? So there's this like...
but there is a kind of erotic
disdain, or go on, definitely.
No, but I mean, fetish.
It goes into the womb of the machine, you know, and disappears sometimes as well. You know? And he moves about it like this kind of spider that knows it's inside out. You know?
Right.
And there's also this moment where he runs these, you know, these runnels, like these little funnel things, you know, where they say that when there's blood and water run down these runnels, okay, and he's like doing this kind of putting on this big spectacle and show and like saying, look, this is what happens. And they said that to make it especially vivid, he ran down to the end of the runnel, you know, where the blood and water disappear into the pit, and he cupped his hand, you know, as if to say, here, this is where the blood comes out, you know? And what I was trying to say before is there's a mixture of enthusiasm, eroticized reverence, but also a sense of like his conscience isn't functioning properly. He doesn't really know what he's doing. It's almost like he's lost the sense that he's talking about someone's death, you know. He's lost the sense that he's talking about blood. And I think that comes from, that's why you're hesitant to call him a sadist, because he doesn't take pleasure in the pain, you know. He doesn't take pleasure in the act of violence.
He takes pleasure in the operation of the bureaucracy himself.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So it's like... the violence doesn't exist anymore. You know, it's a bit like someone working in an arms dealership. You know, imagine you go into the accountancy department of like an arms dealership, you know, Raytheon or something, and the guy is like, okay, look, here's how you do this particular kind of calculation, you know, for, you know, nuclear missiles. There's a very particular way in which you must do the accounting books here, and it's done in green pen at the top, you know, and look how. Do you see the flourish there? The boss really loves that kind of flourish to make it look more professional. Do you know? And he's like completely lost the sense that he's talking about the sale of nuclear arms. You know, or like that article that I shared with you the other day about the Lawyers for Israel. Do you remember? And so the Lawyers for Israel team released this kind of paper that criticized the science journal Lancet, who had made like various predictions about the death toll, the eventual death toll of like the invasion of Gaza. And they'd figured it out at about like 180,000 or something. And the Lawyers for Israel were really upset about this, and they'd come in and they'd said, yeah, but look, certain things haven't been taken into consideration. For example, we've got figures and stats that tell us that obesity was a great cause of death in Gaza, prior to the invasion. But now, due to the famine, we don't have to worry about deaths due to obesity anymore. So that would affect the overall, estimated death toll. And you think these guys are so wrapped up in the process of like legal dispute and cavilling and like, argumentative minutiae that they forgot what they're arguing about. They forgot the background of genocide. And I think there's this obliviousness. I don't know what to call it. It's almost like the psychosis of monofunction. You're so focused on one particular operation that you go into this state of like parallel existence, psychosis, where you've forgotten that you're like, I don't know, like a cat torturer, enjoying like the nuances of whimper and groan in the cat that he's just opened up and now prodding with a needle. Do you hear? He's like playing upon the cat's like nervous system, like a pianist, and maybe he's creating beautiful music, maybe there is some kind of like, charm and mellifluousness to the way in which he's mixing up different groans and whimpers of the cat. But in his excitement, he's forgot that he's torturing a cat, So there's this like lapse of conscience or something. And you see it again and again in this play. It's like, the strap breaks, and he's like, I've told them, what can I do if they don't buy me proper straps? Is anybody thinking about that? There's this line where or like the prisoner has just vomited because he's put this felt in his mouth, and he's like, for God, I've told them they need to abide strict fasting regulations, But these ladies, they're filling these prisoners with sugar candies, This guy's only ever eaten rotten fish the whole of his life, and he's about to go to his death, and they start feeding him sugar candies. So it's like all his concerns are about the machine, about its operation, and so on. Like, and he's not thinking, well, he's about to die. Like, give the poor guy some sweets, or the the strap is not the important thing here. It's like he's so concerned about professionalism, about the operationality, about the mechanism that he's. Do you see what I mean? There's a massive blind spot that's opened up here, and I think that is a feature of bureaucracy. That like I do want to link that to some comment about bureaucracy in itself. You get so focused about like the rules become so labyrinthine and complex that they require a certain kind of like virtuosity in order to be able to navigate them. In order to be able to work out, shit, how do I play this law off against that law, and argue down the sentencing time. If I plead guilty to this, even though he didn't really commit that crime, what I can do is I can justify charging him under this crime, plead guilty, and get a lower sentence than I would have got if he was eventually found guilty for another. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah, and you forgot that you're getting a mass murderer out of prison. 20 after 20 years. You're just playing this game. You're absorbed into this game, and reality kind of disintegrates in the background. There's some kind of irrelevance.
But there's also something with that where it has this kind of parallel function of, completely reducing the other or forgetting about the other person. When you get trapped in all these like legalities, right? The other person, like the judgment or like the process that you are about to like the sentence of, to the other person, which it is all about, is suddenly somehow like this other person's fate in a way has become not irrelevant, but you have completely kind of forgotten about the other person. Somehow, in which the commander or the officer in this case is like, he has no concern for this guy who also, by the way, I don't know if it's in your text, but somehow he does speak French also, right? I don't know if this is a fucking glitch or what we are supposed to make.
I don't remember that.
No, but he yells something that we know what it is, right? It's something about, I will eat you alive or something like this.
Yeah, but isn't that in the report of The officer.
Yeah, but I mean,
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
yeah,
okay.
we don't know. Like, is it in his native language? We don't know. But well, I don't know.
Look, I'm going to pass on to you, but I just remember there's actually a really good example that just fits with that thing that I just said. There's this moment where he's talking about how the executions used to be. Okay. And he's saying in those days, there'd be this kind of immaculate silence. Yeah. So you could hear every single groan of the prisoner. And he says, now we can't even produce a groan that's not stifled by the gag, you know? And he said, and then he's like casually drops in. And that's because like we used to use this acid fluid back in the day, you know, and that really
Not
got
allowed
them
anymore. Yeah.
that really got them shrieking. But with, you know, some stupid bureaucratic red tape rules mean that we can't use that anymore. You know, this kind of, I think that just fits in with everything I've been saying. Go on, Luke, what did you want to say?
Oh well. So if I may, so I have a few things. So just directly in response to what we were talking about in the context of Foucault and his and we all share a certain hesitancy around this word sadism. Now, the artistic work that we're doing together, of course, explicitly draws on the sad. Yet, you read Justine and Patrick put it in a really marvelous way the other day. Now I'm too overconscious of the word remarkable. So I'm too marvelous, but this notion.
It's actually backhanded compliment,
Yeah, no.
We need to talk about this.
He was talking about Patrick was talking about the perfect criminal as a man who was dancing with a cane at the end of the universe. And I think that the part of if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but my intuition suggests to me that part of our hesitancy or reticence around this word of sadism in regards to the work of Kafka is because that word has been robbed of its rixture, robbed of its rixture, and it's turned into a runnel, which is the other thing I was like, there are two good words that we need to make sure are added to the English dictionary that we've created: rixture and runnel. But there is this sense of the marvelous instrument. Now, something that me and Patrick have talked about is this notion of terminal bureaucracy, of kind of mortal or suicidal bureaucracy, of kind of. I'd be really interested to hear what you think, Jacob, if you can just hold it in your head of like the. So something that I found interesting about bureaucracies is, of course, this notion in which they absorb people. And people's absorption becomes such that they are kind of coterminous with the bureaucracy. As Patrick was saying about they forget what the bureaucracy is for, or what it does, or what it achieves, or what it's meant to be there for. They are simply bureaucracy itself. And that, to me, is bureaucracy in its terminal or mortal phase. And that is, to me, an interesting way to read in the Penal Colony. Is where bureaucracy itself kind of has a consciousness which is one of death drive. Where the I don't know. Patrick, help me out here. Because I'm not a literary scholar, and whenever I read banal, the kind of banal texts of literary criticism, they always talk about and you would be very familiar with this because. In English literature examinations at GCSE and A level, they talk about the narrator, So in Wuthering Heights, they talk about the guy who introduces and they talk about him as an unreliable narrator, And then, so there's this question of like narration in literature and literary criticism, and here, you were speaking before about something that there was this. There was like an undertone or a sense that problem is something that you're trying to work out, but you because it's part of your field, your discipline, even though it's not your thoughts, but that there is something about this question or problem of narration. And that, Kafka embodies from the start. And this is what I was saying before, and I had to leave for a moment, is these three kind of ways, in Kafka, it's always in question. Who is narrating this? What is the perspective? What is, and we could go on in this kind of boring way. In Hunter S. Thompson, well, he introduces precisely the confusion to come. It was on the edge of Barstow that the drugs took hold. So Kafka, the confusion is there immediately. Thompson, the confusion is announced as something that is to arrive. Melville, call me Ishmael. Like the confusion is in a sense right there, but then wrapped up. And then this is something that I think will become very interesting as we move through Foucault and we get to Discipline and Punish. Now, something that's gone on unremarked in Discipline and Punish, I don't have its hand, but let me just see if I can quickly find a version, because this is very important for the reading of Foucault. And like I said, it's in all of the hundreds of commentaries I've read, in blah, 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 blah. No one has remarked upon this. And it also links to Les Mots et les Choses, and it links to the beginning of Discipline and Punish. Now, so here we go. And I've read part of this before, part one, torture. Now, here's the important thing about, how Foucault offers like a kind of different space of narration. So it's part one, torture. Chapter 1, the body of the condemned. On the 2nd of March, 1757, Damiens the regicide was condemned, and then, quote, to make the amende honorable before the main door of the Church of Paris, where he was to be taken, conveyed in a cart wearing nothing but a shirt, holding a torch of wax weighing 2 pounds. Then, the then is outside of the quotation. Quotation begins again. In said cart to the Place de Grève, where on a scaffold that will be erected there, the flesh will be torn from his breasts, arms, thighs, calves with red-hot pincers, his right hand holding sulphur, and on those places where the flesh will be torn away, poured molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, wax and sulphur melted together, and then his body drawn and quartered by four horses, and his limbs consumed by fire, reduced to ashes, and his ashes thrown to the winds. Now then, in parentheses, pièce originale. So he adopts a certain kind of like curation of story, right? He, on the 2nd of March, this is Foucault talking, but then immediately he gives it into quotes. Now, this particular quote from Pièce Originale is perspective. Okay, and then immediately, what does he go to? Finally, he was quartered, recounts the Gazette d'Amsterdam of 1st of April, 1757, right? So again, he's curating, and what he's doing is he's kind of exhausting the possibilities of authorial representation, right? Now then, after this, Bouton, an officer of the watch, left his account. So you see, we have firstly the prospective in some kind of collection of, important journalism of the year. This is what's going to happen. Then we have a retrospective. Again, this is kind of what happened. And then he goes to a witness statement. Now, these maneuvers are kind of like very familiar and like quite Hegelian in a way to, what he does in his analysis of Les Mananas by Velasquez at the start of Les Mots et les Choses. In that analysis, he praises the work of Velasquez because he says that the work in Las Meninas exhausts the possibilities of representation that were available at a specific age. Now, Foucault, became very interested, obsessed, consumed with the problem of confession. And I think it's fascinating to see that, this kind of narratorial problem in Kafka, where we are always kind of like unaware. We are always unaware. And I just want to make one more point about that, and then I will finish and just throw it back to the floor, and then I have the passage that I have to read. But we are. Sorry, Jacob, are you muting yourself, or
You what?
you just you became muted?
Yeah, no, I did that myself.
Oh, okay. Just wondering if there's, perhaps a diabolical, infernal, death drive, suicidal machine that's taking control of your broadcast.
Get him off the air.
No, but I think that there's something interesting here, because Foucault talks often of the reduction of all narrative to the confessional tone, and that's something that we've worked together, on with Emersham's death, that you've had a preoccupation with in your previous artistic works. Which is a tone that might be, confessional. And actually, I think in a previous seminar, I talked about a specific moment in Emersham's death, and it's one of the two moments that I really love and adore, and I thought was, a work of true genius and masterpiece. And it was the moment when there's a shift. I mean, to explain the depth and rixture of the shift.
Hey. Ja, vi håller på.
To demonstrate or display the rixture of the shift is too much, but it's that moment, where it's instructional and kind of didactic, right? And you build up all these things as this deep texture of these instructional videos. You have to, and then it's like boom, close, and then this guy comes and he's like, I have no job, I'm homeless, and to me it's the most beautiful moment in the film, this way that you build up this texture and then you kind of drop it into this thing that's absolutely opposite to it, where it ceases to be confessional and or it becomes confessional. I don't know, like I said, I haven't really thought about it, but it's just like a moment of real beauty. And then it goes to the guy who becomes didactic and instructional again. But I just think it's interesting to talk about, to remark, to remark, to reinscribe, Foucault into this text. Because, Foucault was a huge fan of Kafka, of course. And, the imaginary of Kafka plays a huge role in Foucault. But the way in which that he announces these kind of narratorial possibilities and curates them, and then he talks about the confession as the dominant mode of Western exposition, and then that links to the last thing I want to say, which is from a different work of Kafka, his unfinished work, which I consider to be his masterpiece, The Castle. Now, why is it his masterpiece? And Patrick mentioned before about irreceivability and the scene on the phone. He was talking about the castle. Now the thing in the castle is there is it's the first time when there is a moment of redemption, and the moment of redemption is provided by the assistants. And so I just want to throw this in and see what you do with it. But this moment of redemption is the most beautiful example to me is that, so he's got there and he's been provided these assistants. Somehow he's ended up working as a janitor of a school and he wants a fire. So he asks his assistants to go and collect him some wood so he can make a fire to heat up the room that he's teaching in. Now, he looks out of the window and what does he see? But his assistants cartwheeling in the snow. Right? And he thinks, God, you're ridiculous. God, you're useless. Da, 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 da. However, later in the text, when the assistants are free from their function, essentially their function was to provide slapstick comedy. So they were his assistants. So there was a veracity. There was a truth to their function. And that function was directed by the elusive officer of the bureaucracy, Clam. Now, Clam is a Slavic word for illusion. And this is something that I think Kafka is playing with all the time, but is manifested most in The Castle. The name of the bureaucratic officer is illusion, yet he is real. The assistants, They do not assist the land surveyor in his task as he believed they would. Yet later on, when they are freed from their duty of assisting him, it is revealed that, well, the assistants, you know, the one of them says in you know, he's kind of annoyed. He's like, look, you know, this was our job. This was given to us by Clam. And so basically, what Clam had said to the assistants was, look, you know, this guy is in our town. He's going to be depressed and it's going to be sad. He needs a bit of life. He needs a bit of happiness. He needs a bit of, you know, a bit of vitality. He needs a joke or two. He needs that thrown in. So they were performing that function.
Yeah, but they were absolutely like uninterpretable and irreceivable in that way, because Kay just thinks of them as being utterly useless, like, and incompetent, and you know.
That's what I mean about that. There is something in Kafka that always speaks of redemption.
Yeah. Okay.
Every one of his stories, if we are to read it in the way that we've spoken before, you know, in a kind of like as a parable, as a teaching, as a lesson, so something that demands a certain kind of reading. Kafka is not the author of despair and hopelessness, not at all. Kafka is a comic, and all of his works always possess this hope of redemption, this hope that you were just mistaken. You know, all of his works, whether or not that's the metamorphosis, whether or not that's the impossibility of living, whether or not that's processes or the trial, you know, Kafka's works always possess in them this notion of redemption. And I think, just to circle back and then finish and throw it to the floor, I think that, you know, that there is something about his narratory, let's call it narratory style, you know, which is always one of confusion or, you know, disorder, or perhaps it, you know, begins with order and enters into a space of confusion. You know, whether or not, you know, there's always something more strange, more mercurial, more evasive, more elusive going on in Kafka's narration.
No, I agree with what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that at the same time, there is always a message of hope, and there is always a message of redemption. And, you know, a big part of the work of me and Patrick on Kafka is to restore Kafka to his proper sense. You know, Kafka is not the auteur of hopelessness, of despair, of terminal bureaucracy. Kafka is a comic. He is hilarious. I read Kafka, and honestly, I am slapping my sides and peeling with laughter. And just a small historical anecdote. So Kafka and his friend Max Brod, or Brul, or, you know, I don't know how you say it in German, the person in charge of his, how do you say, you know, what happens after you die?
Estate, no?
Yeah. His estate. So they were sat in Munich, and they were reading the Munich paper. And in the paper, now remember that Kafka is always characterized as Kafkaesque, right? He takes on this linguistic dimension of a kind of mood, you know, which is very interesting. And Max was sat with Kafka while Kafka was reading the review of his published short story collection, Meditation, from 1913. Yes, from Meditation. He was reading the review, and the journalist from this Munchen-based newspaper, they described Kafka as Chaplin-esque. And Kafka, on reading on this, burst into peals of laughter. He was filled with joy. You know, he was like, fucking hell, someone gets me. Someone understands me. And it only like clocked to me when I was watching like a Charlie Chaplin movie, and I was watching this Charlie Chaplin movie, and I was just like, this is Kafka. You know, this is Kafka. So anyway, yeah. Sorry, long kind of diversion, and I do have something to read, but yeah, I'll throw it back to the floor and, you know, see what you think about these things.
I have a slightly like I have a kind of not digression, but just something that I picked up like what kind of reading it, and it's this thing with I don't know if you like. To me, at least, it was a bit new. This thing with the kind of the French penal colony, and then like as far as I understand, it's like very likely that Kafka was inspired by this kind of penal colony of Cayenne, which was called the Devil's Island. Are you like have you read about this, or are you in this thing? I don't know. I found it super interesting. This idea that like okay, so like yeah, I guess there's a kingdom at this point. So France kind of starts deporting, in a sense, all their kind of a lot of prisoners, and I think it was like at some point it was more political prisoners, and it was in this Dreyfus scandal, right? He was placed on this island, so he became very known. But it's like it. So supposedly this is the kind of background that Kafka sort of plays with and draws on, and then we have the kind of the galley slaves, which were like these kind of men that were like fettered down in these galleys that couldn't move, that were kind of moored in a harbor or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And
to charge to row the ships.
Yeah. Like, but then at some point you stop doing that, right? I mean, I think it's like early 1800s. Surely you don't have those kind of ships anymore. But I don't know. I just found this super interesting, and also this idea that like Louis XIV, at some point, like he would try to get men not sentenced to death, but sentenced to be galley slaves to increase his fleet. So France had this like massive population of prisoners who were galley slaves, and supposedly on this island, like 80,000 prisoners were sent to this island, and most of them never returned. And it would like, of course, it was like it's the tropics, like it's French Guiana, right? So you have like mosquitoes, disease, like practically probably a death sentence to just go there, right, as a prisoner, even though they were kind of labor camps, I think. And yeah, no, there was just something about this that was really interesting, which he says nothing of, and like we don't know much about this, but there were all these kind of like an interesting historical background to this thing, I feel.
I don't know what to make of that because I don't know enough about it. The only character who could plausibly fit into that category is the condemned man, I guess. And I don't know, like, the thing about the condemned man is he's like comically useless, Several points he's made to look like a complete, idiot. And there's a moment when, the traveler actually says he's not even like someone, I can't even kick up a feeling of enthusiasm or righteousness in defending him because he's someone that's not even really worth saving, And you get, even in that first paragraph, you have this idea that, what does it say? That, that he was, he seemed so like a submissive dog that he looked like he could be set free to run around the neighboring fields, and you'd only need to call him back with a whistle when the execution was due to begin. So how do I imagine that linking to the galley slave thing? Well, I don't know, but one thing I don't know, for some reason I always imagine galley slaves.
But
like
he doesn't speak
bulky
French, right? So he's a native, like he's a Guyanan or whatever he is, probably, right? Supposedly.
Yeah, I don't know, but I feel
if we accept this historical background.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I accept it, because I think that Kafka's stories are always abstract in some way. Even if they can be derived or inspired. Obviously, they're not like, often written in cuckoo land, on cloud 9 or something. But I don't know if they're ever like. It's almost like there's a difference between bureaucracy, which is a kind of abstract structure, that can be realized in a whole variety of different ways, and then a very specific island, with its kind of particularities and peculiarities, that's run, Kafka is like the person who's trying to deduce the structure, almost like the universal structure of like the zeitgeist or something, rather than give you an anthropology of some particular culture, or some.
Yeah, but I just think it's kind of macabre that probably this is the background. There is this. It's well known at the time. There is this penal colony outside of the French Guiana, what the fuck is it called? I can't remember the name now. This group of islands, basically like the Sanctuary Islands or something like this. But then the fact that it was kind of a death sentence to just be sent there, but then Kafka kind of, like, I don't know what he does, but he introduces then this spectacular machine on the island, and then the machine is kind of so spectacular, and it's this machine of execution where just being on the island was a kind of execution in a sense, right? I don't know. It's just interesting.
No, we do see that, for example, like, you know, this idea, you cannot possibly read this as like Kafka being on the side of the new commandant, because if you think about what did the you know, there are certain rules that are obviously themselves advocated and, like, you know, brought into action by the new commandant. One of those rules is that there are these soldiers who function as both sentry guards and kind of servants or slaves, basically, to the senior officers. And it's, what was he actually tried for? You know, what is he being punished for? Well, for dereliction of duty. Well, what is his duty? His duty is to wake up every hour in this pointless, like, ritualistic salute of the, you know, the captain's door. You know, and instead of doing that, he slept. You know, he was there sleeping like a dog. You know, obviously, normally, because humans need sleep. So you've already, that does link to what you're saying. You've already got this really draconian, you know, and you know, disciplinarian society in which already functions like a prison, like a form of punishment. You know, well, that's what I mean. That's contained in the idea of a penal colony anyway. But so then, what is the most extreme form of punishment inside a society which is itself a punishment? You know,
right?
Yeah, so I can kind of see some of these things that you're talking about.
I mean, okay, last thing about this historical thing that I thought was interesting. It was apparently that it was quite common in some history. I mean, it was operated for 100 years, so probably many things changed and stuff like that. But apparently they had a system at some point where you had to be, like, so say you got sentenced for X amount of time as a prisoner, then you had to be a prison guard for the same amount of time after you had been kind of serving your sentence. Which I thought, you know, like, it's kind of also just historical anecdote, but just interesting in the kind of milieu of a penal colony.
Well, that is hilarious, because that is in the story, because, you know, they get that moment where the prisoner has been released. Okay, yeah. So and the traveller expects it to be a moment of jubilation and festivity, but one of the first things he does, like when he sees that the officer has pinned himself to the machine, is he runs up and he makes sure the straps are done. Yeah. This can't take place without the straps being in their proper positions.
Yeah.
So he does actually make this shift from, you know, prisoner to prison guard. You know, the guy who's been subject to the punishment to the guy who's overseeing and, you know, carrying out the punishment. So that does kind of link to your idea of, okay, one time you're the prisoner and the next time you're the prison guard. You know? And he thinks of the way that he interprets, and this links back to Luke's idea of I don't know what to call it, but the mashup of perspective in Kafka. You know, the way in which narratively Kafka texts are created as like collages, not even of perspective, but of moments or vignettes, you know, or reactions, you know. And there's never like this omniscient authorial voice, only like anecdotes or parodies of like the authorial omnipotent voice. But shit, fucking hell, it's just gone out of my head. What the hell was I about to say? There's where was I? What was I saying? So you've got the guy with the straps.
Don't know, man.
You're getting back to the old sadism, you know.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So yeah, sorry, this is what I was going to say. So it shifts to his perspective and his understanding of what the officer is doing. Now he thinks that the explorer or the traveller has brought this about, you know, in and through, I don't know, his own authority, his own mysterious authority or whatever it is. And he says that yes, this is a moment of revenge. Okay, that I wasn't like harmed to the end, but my revenge will be carried out nonetheless all the way to its end. Okay. And you can see how in your, like, you know, penal colony example, or this particular French penal colony, this shift or transition from being a prisoner to be the prison guard. Why does that work? Well, because in a weird way, you now get revenge. You know,
exactly.
like not necessarily on the people that were prison guards over you, but on the system itself. This is your moment of catharsis and backlash, and where you're able to operate in the position of punisher of whatever it is. And so I thought that's nice. And obviously, so there are these. What Kafka is able to do is he's able to keep in this moment of like stillness and harmony a whole variety of utterly incompatible perspectives. The perspectives that don't tessellate. The plates kind of like they don't fit together somehow. And Luke talks about like the Kafka text beginning in a state of chaos or confusion, and then he hesitated and he was like, well, do they really? And I think they do. But what they do is they exist in a state of almost muted confusion. Like you don't realize how much chaos there is here, okay? Because the voice is very deadpan, But if you just think, like, go back to what Jacques was reading earlier, think of like how much is introduced even in this first paragraph, and I'll read this like paragraph. It's a remarkable piece of apparatus. So first of all, a statement by the officer. Said the officer to the explorer, and surveyed with a certain air of admiration the apparatus which was after all quite familiar to him. So here's a guy who's able to admire what is still familiar to him. So this is a very strange relationship that we're always being introduced to. Okay, you've got the statement of a kind of like wonder. This is a singularity. This is something remarkable. This is something amazing. And also this relationship of something that's both familiar to him and then admirable. Then we get the indifference of the explorer. The explorer seems to have accepted merely out of politeness, blah, blah, blah. And then we get the idea that we're in this kind of no man's land. This is not a place. This is not the center of this civilization. Okay. This is in a place of like a neglected spot, a deserted spot of this region. Nor did the colony itself betray much interest in the execution. At least in the small sandy valley, a deep hollow surrounded on all sides by naked crags, there was no one present save the officer, the explorer, and the condemned man. And then we get suddenly this shift to the condemned man. Who's he then? This new character that's been put into play. Well, he is just this wide-mouthed creature with bewildered hair and face, and the soldier who held the heavy chain controlling the small chains locked on the prisoner's ankles, wrists, and neck, chains that were themselves attached to each other by communicating links. So we've got this assemblage, an ensemble of characters, none of whom are occupying, if you like, the same point of view, but even more radically than that, none of whom are sharing the same world. We get the sense that they're all living on their own little, like, rafts of like, reality, their own little kind of like islands of reality. And like, Wittgenstein said, to share a language is to share a world, to share a form of life. These people don't share the same form of life. And there are these little hints, like the first thing that the explorer says to the officer disappoints the officer. He says, oh, those clothes must be heavy. And the officer is already angry that he's not talking about the machine, And he kind of impatiently and impetuously responds to him and says, well, yeah, because they remind us of home, and it's important not to forget your homeland. So there's this idea that even the things they notice and are interested in are not the same, and they don't have them in common. Or later on, when the traveller tries to start talking about, the system of justice, and the officer just wants to skip on to describing the mechanisms of the contraption of the machine. He doesn't want to talk about this system of justice, and he thinks that the traveller is a kind of child for asking these naive questions. But you see what I'm saying? There is this what Luke was talking about as a confusion of narrative voices, or a jumble of different voices, or let's say, this kind of like collage of perspectives is fundamentally related to this idea that these people don't know each other and will never know each other. These people seem to misunderstand and misprize everything that the other people are saying. There is no moment at which they share a world.
Could I just make a mark here in my head, because there are some kind of like beautiful words that we've kind of like conjured up by accident, and I'd like us to remember these words and, you know, reflect on them at a later time. So the first is the etim. And there is, which is, I think Patrick introduced that word, which is beautiful and ironic, you know, because etim, of course, being the stem of etymological, and then I don't know, there's something really beautiful about that. This notion of the etim and the runnel, you know, this sense of a run and tunnel, and I mean, there's a grand kind of metaphorical play there, in the sense of etim. And then, you know, I was just thinking about my word, rixture. And then I was thinking that, well, it has this sense of mixture, but really, you know, no, I mean rexture. You know, this bringing together of the notion of perhaps repetition and texture or interruption. Rixture, rexture, etim. I think it's just some really interesting concepts that have come about in this conversation that I'd just like to mark, and, you know, for us to think about at a later date. I don't know why, but I think that they are incredibly beautiful and rich. And I wanted to, because I think that, you know, kind of when we, you know, messaged at the start and we said, you know, choose a passage and you know, we'll each read that passage and then, you know, throw the floor out. I feel that this passage that was the passage that I chose, and it was the one that I said when we were speaking in the messages, that I have only questions. I feel that in a sense it is the resolution of many of your thoughts, ruminations, and questions, and it is the second to last paragraph of the Penal Colony. As the explorer, with the soldier and the condemned man behind him, reached the first houses of the colony, the soldier pointed to one of them and said, "There is the tea house." In the ground floor of the house was a deep, low, cavernous space, its walls and ceiling blackened with smoke. It was open to the road all along its length. Although this tea house was very little different from the other houses of the colony, which were all very dilapidated, even up to the commandant's palatial headquarters, it made on the explorer the impression of a historic tradition of some kind, and he felt the power of past days. He went near to it, followed by his companions, right up between the empty tables that stood in the street before it, and breathed the cool, heavy air that came from the interior. "The old man's buried here," said the soldier. "The priest wouldn't let him lie in the churchyard. Nobody knew where to bury him for a while, but in the end, they buried him here. The officer never told you about that, for sure, because of course that's what he is most ashamed of. He even tried several times to dig up the old man by night, but he was always chased away." "Where is the grave?" asked the explorer, who found it impossible to believe the soldier. At once, both of them, the soldier and the condemned man, ran before him, pointing with outstretched hands in the direction where the grave should be. They led the explorer right up to the back wall, where guests were sitting at a few tables. They were apparently dock labourers, strong men with short, glistening, full black beards. None had a jacket. Their shirts were torn. They were poor, humble creatures. As the explorer drew near, some of them got up, pressed close to the wall, and stared at him. "It's a foreigner," ran the whisper around him. "He wants to see the grave." They pushed one of the tables aside, and under it there really was a gravestone. It was a simple stone, low enough to be covered by a table. There was an inscription on it in very small letters. The explorer had to kneel down to read it. This was what it said: "Here rests the old commandant. His adherents, who now must be nameless, have dug this grave and set up this stone. There is a prophecy that after a certain number of years, The commandant will rise again and lead his adherents from the house to recover the colony. Have faith and wait. When the explorer had read this and risen to his feet, he saw all the bystanders around him smiling, as if they too had read the inscription, had found it ridiculous, and were expecting him to agree with them. The explorer ignored this, distributed a few coins among them, waited till the table was pushed over the grave again, quitted the tea house, and made for the harbour.
Yeah, that's really amazing because first of all, why does he run away at this point? I feel like this running away, like he leaves then in a kind of panic, and I think it's because he realizes that this world is just this place is completely beyond his understanding. He thought he could intervene in some decisive, like emphatic way. He thought he could contribute his little piece. But if you think about it, who are supposed to be on the side of the old commandant? Well, the working class people are supposed to be on their side. You know, the tea house is this place that's inhabited by like the dock workers and stuff. And you know, and again, I'm just thinking now the dock is really important because the harbour is the thing that the new commandant keeps trying to pour all his money into. So he's probably also overworking the dock workers. Anyway, so it's like he thinks that the old commandant is definitely bad. He's into this kind of medieval torture. He's this kind of draconian leader. So he's like a guy from yesterday. And yeah, he goes into this tea room and the working class are all on his side. You know, and I wonder whether in that moment there's Kafka is playing like a joke where he says, "Oh, they seem to be laughing, you know, at the inscription." But laughter is one of these things that always tricks us, you know. Like if you walk down the street and someone is laughing, you immediately think they're laughing at me, you know, or there's some kind of threat there in the laughter. Or that when you tell a joke, you're like, there's always this ambiguity. Did they laugh at, like, are they laughing at me because of the way in which I'm pronouncing this or something, you know, or are they laughing with me? Like my friend came to England the other day and was in a pub and there were these two Welsh guys, one of whom pretended that he was Ian Rush. You know, if you don't know who that is, like one of the like most famous, you know, ex-Liverpool striker. You know, and my friend like believed it the whole time. You know, and so there's this idea that is that playful humour or is that like, you know, a moment where he's being ridiculed, you know, and humiliated. Anyway, so I think that Kafka is almost saying there, leaving a space where we can actually just absolutely distrust the choice of words of the narrator. You know, what was the idea what was the exact word, Luke, like that he said at the end? What about the laughter?
When the explorer had read this and risen to his feet, he saw all the bystanders around him smiling, as if they too had read the inscription and had found it ridiculous, and were expecting him to agree with them. The explorer ignored this, distributed a few coins among them, waited until the table was pushed over the grave again, quitted the tea house, and made for the harbour.
Yeah, so I just think there's something radically like, you know, untrustworthy about our perceptions when you're in that awkward state of being in a strange environment where people are smiling at you, you know, this weird place. You don't know what they're laughing at really. And Kafka like uses that clever as if, you know, as if to introduce this idea of like uncertainty, hesitation. And then he flees. He flees precisely in this moment where, you know, it's the smiles, the ambiguous, enigmatic smiles that make him realize that this place is just an unknown environment to him, a place he cannot understand, that he hasn't got to grips with. You know?
I think my first interpretation was that similarly with the jackals and the Arabs, that he was like the old commander resurrected. You know, but and then he's like, "Whoa, you know, like what the fuck are they? What is going on here?" You know, like,
Well, he's being prepped for that kind of role as being a spokesman for, you know, the old master, the old commandant's principles. You know, that's where they see him, or at least where the officer tries to like insert him. You know, in his little, you know, game and choreography.
Yeah, I think my first reading was that is, you know, that's what he thinks they're trying to do, and then also, of course, either for just the complete madness of the whole scenario, or maybe and particularly for that reason, just decides to leave the island.
Mm-hmm.
This is too crazy, you know. They're trying to trap me into this
Definitely
kind of loop of the penal colony.
Yeah. And that's interesting as well, because it's like almost like to continue a tradition, you need a constant like injection of energy from the outside in the form of the stranger. If you think about like
the stranger king.
Yeah, the stranger king, exactly. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
In Greek mythology, it's always the king always comes from outside. You know, he comes into the city. He like, you know, whatever, solves the, like Oedipus solves the riddle that gets rid of the Sphinx. You know, or he kills a monster. You know, or he's able to rid the city of a plague, and then he becomes the king and the sovereign. And
or he returns dressed as a beggar like Odysseus.
Yeah, well, Odysseus doesn't save any cities, though, I suppose, but
no, he does. He saves Ithaca from rack and ruin.
Okay, all right. Well, he saves his own city. Yeah. But one second. This thing is because it also links to something, a more general idea, like in that thing in Mary Midgley, where as an initiation rite for boys that are about to enter manhood, they get like kind of sent off into the wilderness, and there's this idea that what they bring back with them is like the energy of the forest, the energy of savagery. Now, during that period of initiation, they're in this state of moral limbo. And if they cross one of the citizens from the country they've just left, they're allowed to like rape them, rob them, you know, set fire to them. And there's a kind of complete immunity from the law. So not only do they absorb the energy of the forest, they absorb the energy of lawlessness as well, and of crime. And when they come back, the comportment towards them is one of caution, because they're going to be dangerous, because they're carrying this energy, but also one of reverence, because they almost exist like they're the ones that are going to fuel this society. They've brought back a richness that's now going to be harvested for the benefit of this society. So whenever the guest turns up, like in my example with the head of English, he thinks, okay, this is the people that's going to, like, it's almost like the vampire, you know, these are the people that I'm going to welcome into my circle, and they're going to give me the lifeblood that I need in order to be able to dominate this school, you know. And the same thing with the Kafka stories, like, you know, the outsider is often someone who's going to be digested or metabolized by this system into which he's entered, and used as kind of like for the benefit of the community in some way. It reminds me of what like Baudrillard said. I think I mentioned it a couple of seminars ago, but the idea that the pure form of hospitality is cannibalism, you know. And you get these stories of like missionaries who are loved by tribes, you know. They adored these missionaries. They gave them prestigious places amongst the priests, you know. They loved the fact that the missionaries learnt the language, you know, and became eloquent enough in this language to tell stories about their homeland. And then as a mark of their appreciation, they organized a special festival for the missionaries, at the end of which they were eaten, as a sign of how much they loved them so much they wanted to make them part of them themselves, you know. And this is the idea that Kafka returns to, that there is another form of cannibalism, you know, that's less literal, that involves the digestion of your otherness, you know, that involves the digestion of you as stranger, as guest, into something that can be, again, just to repeat myself, used as fuel and sustenance to re-energize this system. I'm thinking as well about this, like, think about like even in our own rituals, how whenever you turn up at someone's house, you've got to bring a present, you know. And this present is like an effigy, a stand-in for you. You know, it somehow placates or assuages the voracity of the host. The host wants to eat you, but instead you give him this bottle of wine, or this potato salad, Or think about the way in which kids come in and like harass and heckle a guest, and the guest has to kind of fight them off with gifts. Well, what have you got at the end of this Kafka story? What does he do when he's in this moment of alarm and he has to fight off the dock workers? He gives them money, like coins, shares out the coins amongst them as a kind of decoy or distraction, and then legs it. And I feel like there is something like there's something linking all those things together.
Yeah, no, there absolutely is, and I want to make a proposal. But in our kind of aventure amoureux with Foucault, I think these diversions and they are beautiful. I really enjoyed reading Kafka in the Penal Colony, and it speaks to something Jacques, that me and Patrick have kind of exhausted of possibilities, but it's the work of Cavell and the admissibility of Emerson into philosophy, which has all sorts of kind of themes and schemas. Now, Patrick suggested something that we agreed with, which was that before we read The Abnormal, we have this thing where Patrick's son comes. And we talk about Finding Nemo. Speaking about the receivability of a person into a particular kind of philosophical space. I think that's fucking let's go. That's a challenge. As I said in the messages, it's a challenge for us. It's a challenge for us to be able to receive this young man and his thoughts, and to let's see what happens. But I just thought, as part of what may be an interlude or maybe a season, is that so Hattrick was talking about initiatory rights and he was talking about cannibalism. Now, of course, the community that I lived with, the Guarani, they were or are cannibals. The notes of the essay that I take from Bernardino de Sahugen, who I think is the first anthropologist, it's precisely the notes of a missionary. And funnily enough, it's kind of wonderful that you brought up that example, because when I was reading this text, it's called The General History of the New Things of Spain in English. When I was reading this text, I was really confused, so I kind of lifted from it, the kind of like diabolical things from about the Aztec sacrifice. Yet that there is a whole book that is just committed to their words for soil. So it's a whole book that is just a translation of their 80 or 85 words for soil. And what's interesting about that, and it's something that I've kind of mentioned before, but I think is that you were talking a second ago about initiatory rights. Now, I have this like big kind of grand theory about the Lord of the Rings, and I think the films they don't just like cut out like the essential and important bits. They miss the entire purpose of the book. If you look at the and we can approach this in a kind of a systematic educational way. So first we can look at these rituals of sacrifice, of all sorts of things that you were just talking about. Then we can look at and read Lord of the Rings. Now the reason for that is because, number one, again, this is just my I can almost feel the talking of sadism or masochism. I can feel my professors, my old anthropology professors, like flogging me, for my misunderstanding or misinterpretation. However, the rituals that all of the four hobbits go under when they leave the Shire, they are all rituals of sacrifice, formally considered. If you remove the content, consider the form, they're all rituals of sacrifice. And So for me, like the whole the series of films of Lord of the Rings, they don't just like cut out bits that are important. The bookends of Lord of the Rings is what Lord of the Rings is all about. So firstly, it's the depiction of the Shire and its way, which is a pre-enclosure society, a society of symbolic exchange, not money, a society of relativity, reciprocity, of man on man, where eccentricity is valued, is loved, is adored. There's like a Uncle Gamgee with his, like a strangely shaped carrots, which is something, the theme that Terry Pratchett takes up in his later work, specifically The Truth, which is about news. Now, they are sacrificial rituals because, well, what is the end of Lord of the Rings that is missed in the films? It's called the Scouring of the Shire. And that's the point when the hobbits, all of whom have left the Shire, all of whom have undergone these sacrificial rituals, well, then they're kind of what most people think is the meat and bones of the story. All of these adventures and these escapades. Well, what are they? They are fundamentally rituals of preparation so that they can return and save the Shire. Now, how do we know that they are these rituals? Well, not only that there is the formal similarity at the beginning of the story, where all of these rituals, they look sacrificial. So if we look at Bernardino de Sahugan and we look at his description of the Aztec rituals and the way, that those to be sacrificed were bedecked in feathers, were bedecked in flowers, were, the movements at the start of Lord of the Rings, they follow formally exactly the story that de Sahugan makes in his Franciscan friar, but nonetheless anthropological. I make the argument that Bernardino de Sahugan was the first anthropologist. It didn't begin in the 19th century; it began in the 16th century, and it began with de Sahugan. Now, so what happens is they go through all these trials and tribulations, and so fundamentally, firstly, they go through the sacrificial ritual, right? Then the kind of meat and bones of the film is about which I have one more thing to say, but I'll hold it. The whole film is the trials and tribulations that they go through to become the people to do what? Precisely to save the Shire, to come back to the Shire, to restore it from enclosure, to restore it from industrialism. Now, how do we know then, therefore, that these rituals at the start were sacrificial? Well, we know so because of the epilogue. So in the epilogue of Lord of the Rings, sorry to ruin this for you. Spoiler alert. If you read the Lord of the Rings, there is a beautiful epilogue, which is a chronology and a timeline. Now, all of those hobbits who were associated with the ring and with the quest of the ring, they all meet unhappy and horrid ends. Frodo, with his wound and injury from Weathertop, he has to leave to the Grey Havens to never recover. Sam Gamgee, well, what does Sam experience? Because of his contact with the ring, he has a certain kind of immortality, right? So he sees his wife die. He sees his children die. He sees his grandchildren die. He sees the children of his grandchildren die. And at this point, he cannot stand the loss anymore. And he also goes to the Grey Haven as a ring bearer. Merry and Pippin, they also reach unhappy ends. And there is a moment in the chronology where it is Legolas and Gimli, the elf and the dwarf. And at the end, it's very much towards the end of the chronology of Lord of the Rings. And it says very simply, it gives like a date in the kind of Tolkien timeline. And it says Legolas and Gimli made a ship and left the earth to go to the Grey Haven, something like this. Thus ends the Fellowship of the Ring. And now, just to go back to something, because I think it links to exactly what Patrick was saying about consumption, about cannibalism. And it's the moment when, and many people disagree with me on this, but I think it's very obvious. There's a guy called Tom Bombadil. Now, for me, Tom Bombadil is God. He is, if you read the Silmarillion, the figure called Anwi. He is God who has become ashamed with his creation, and he has gone to live in it and make a kind of perfect version of his creation. Now, we know this why? Because at the Council of Rivendell, when they take the ring, when everyone is afraid, when the humans, of course, are, vowed to its corruption, the dwarves, they want to destroy it. Gandalf, he brings up the question of this guy. Well, someone brings up the question. I think, in fact, it's Elrond, the Lord of the Elves. He says, why can we not give this ring to Tom? Now, of course, it doesn't make for good cinema, right? That all of this adventure, and while there's some fucking old guy, who's having a laugh, and we could just give the ring to him and everything would be all right. It doesn't make for good cinema, so they cut Tom out. But what is the moment at which Tom, who is God? Now, how do we know he is God? We know because this ring that was created by Sauron, this whole story, Tom would be able to keep it safe. But what does Gandalf say? He says, yes, we could give it to Tom, and Tom Bombadil, he could keep it safe, but he would fritter it away. To him, it would be something of no importance, right? I.e., Tom has the power to defeat Sauron. He has the power over the whole world. Having such power, he would consider this thing of a ring and our affairs frivolous, ridiculous. He would just lose it. He would forget about it. That's why we cannot give Tom the ring. Now, to bring it back to your notion of cannibalism, what is the moment at which Tom Bombadil appears? What is the moment at which God, ashamed of his own creation, appears in the story? Well, it's precisely this moment when the hobbits are on their way on the first stage of their voyage, and they rest upon a tree. And the tree has been awakened by the elves. So this tree is mischievous, and it begins to eat them. Its roots consume the hobbits. And Tom Bombadil comes. Now, he does not direct the tree. He does not instruct the tree, release the hobbits. He does not do this. And this feeds back into these notions of, because you have to remember that Tolkien was before Heidegger. Now, what did Plato say? All knowledge is forgetting. What did Heidegger say? All knowledge is remembering. What did Foucault say? For those who, base their being on an understanding of those who are forgetting. So, what does Tom sing to the tree? How does he not direct the tree, but in a sense, he seduces the tree? How does he do it? He says, he sings a song. And I don't have it, so I can't do it now. He sings a song. And this song is, remember that you are a tree. You are a tree. Feel the sunlight. Feel the wind. He lulls the tree into itself, away from the devilish mischievousness of the elves. And in doing so, the tree being reminded of itself. Remember, Plato, all knowledge is remembering. The tree being reminded of itself, it doesn't let the hobbits go. It forgets the hobbits. It simply becomes what it is, a tree. And in being the tree that it is, feeling these sensations, feeling the sun, feeling the wind, and enjoying it, it forgets about these little creatures that are at its roots, that before it was, consuming. Anyway, and so I think there is something there about what you were saying about consumption, about cannibalism, about many things.
There is something big there, yeah. Yeah, but it's just like we've got to read 4 books, isn't it?
3, and it's only 3 because Tolkien asked his grandson. So the Lord of the Rings is supposed to be 1 book, and Tolkien gave it to his grandson. His grandson was like, "Yeah, it's fucking wicked, but it's a bit long." So he split it arbitrarily into 3 books: Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, The Return of the King.
Yeah, that's why nothing seems to happen in the first one. Because it's really only the beginning.
No, but everything happens in the first one, and all of those things that I just described to you are not in the film.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's only because I tried to read it to Oscar, and he had this thing that he wasn't in for this whole anthropological, minute analysis of the whole, cosmology of the Shire. It was hard to get him interested in that. Whenever I tried to read it to him at 8 years old,
But yeah. No, do you know it's funny that there's a parallel in my own life? Just as a brief thing, is that
Babes, I have to go.
Okay.
It's time for me to sail out.
All right. Just before you go, Jacob.
Yeah.
Are you down with reading Lord of the Rings
No,
as part of this seminar?
no.
No. All right.
Well, we'll do it at some point in the future. We'll think about it. Yeah, we'll put it on like the bookmark possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I'm down to bookmark it, but to read it, well, see about that.
We have to find out a way of doing it.
I would
Because you
like to
obviously
reread
you
it.
were prompted to think about it again after having mentioned this like scheme we have for the seminar with Oscar. So maybe that's another way of doing it. I don't know. Inviting some kids on. I'm up for that.
Well, anyway, I have to go.
Yeah, I'm gonna go now. I got to eat as well. I didn't even have dinner tonight. So, but
Right.
we just shy of 3 hours. So.
Well, what I mean, any, just to finish, any closing remarks from both of you on Kafka and the Penal Colony and.
I feel the past last like final remarks. I feel like we've drifted in many directions. No, I don't know. No, nothing really. I can kind of conjure up now.
I think we've already got. We've done it. I think.
What was your passage? That was the only thing we didn't do.
Yeah, we didn't do that. No.
What was it?
It was that one when he goes into this kind of like holy rapture, reminiscing over the, the past glory of the machine, and there are like this beautiful moment where he talks about, how the body falls into the pit with a gentle wafting sound, as if you could hear the moment of death itself, this little tremble of death, and also the bit it includes that bit where he says he talks about the engineering difficulties associated with making the machine out of glass, so that and fixing the needles into glass. The harrow has to be made out of glass. Why? Because the only thing you can do with a sentence like the one inscribed into the body is gaze at it. So you have to. Remember, they set up a mini auditorium into which the children are invited, and what the glass structure allows you to do is to see, like in kind of pornographic real time, the sentence being inscribed on the body.
I was thinking about that. I was like, but no way the actual like nails of the harrow or the word, I don't know what to call them, but the actual pins in a sense could be made of glass, because if it broke.
No, they're stuck into glass, aren't they?
Yeah, that must be the thing. Right?
Yeah, so it's like the surface is glass. Yeah. And the engineering difficulty was connecting the needles and the glass.
Right. All right, but
all right, no. Quickly, Jacob, can I detain you just for 1 or 2 minutes? Because this is related to our work together. I just thought that so this is we were talking about scripts and screenplays and how to write them. Would you just be able to read this what I've shared, this passage, which is the first page from the screenplay of The Matrix, and then we can pick up and riff or whatever at a later time?
I can't barely see it, mate. I must say my lights are out. Let's pick this up at a later point. I feel I need to break for now.
So close, it has no boundaries. All right, all good.
Right. Okay, but
all right, cool. Yeah.
Thanks for this time. Well,
yeah, cool. Thanks, Jacob.
Yeah. All right. Ciao.
All right, ciao, guys.
Are we all going? Okay. All right, cool. All right, well, later, next time. We've got to read the Jackals and the Arabs next time as well.
Yeah.
Why don't we just begin with that as a kind of curveball? We read the Foucault and then just begin with a reading of Jackals and Arabs.
In some way, could you Patrick, just to, because I do want to kind of get into this screenplay thing.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
So could you just read what you can see on the screen here? It'll take 30 seconds.
All right,
We can then
fade
get
in
that.
on computer screen. So close it has no boundaries. A blinding cursor pulses in the electric darkness, like a heart coursing with phosphorus light, burning beneath the derma of black neon glass. A phone begins to ring. We hear it as though we were making the call. That's interesting, that. The cursor continues to throb, relentlessly patient, until, man, yeah? Data now slashes across the screen, information flashing faster than we can read. Call trans opt received. 2/19/98, 13/24/18, rec log, woman. Is everything in place? On screen, trace program running. Trace program running. We listen to the phone conversation as though we were on a third line. The man's name is Cypher. The woman, Trinity. Trinity. I said, is everything in place? The entire screen racing with racing columns of numbers. It's astonishing how much like they've yeah, because the essential part of writing a screenplay is also to generate like a sense of like speed, tone, you know, to induce not only to give instructions to a director, but to induce a certain kind of sensibility in him, a way of seeing, a way of feeling, a kind of like almost like you were trying to modify his metabolism and his heart rate. That is interesting, isn't it? It's so excessive with respect to like what we see, but nonetheless,
Yeah.
it really does fit the beginning, you know. The whole like almost like that is a good description of the beginning. But then they've also bizarrely in here because they've written this is written to themselves, you know. The screenplay is this weird thing like a letter to the director, but this one is well, they are also the directors.
Yeah. No, good point.
But it stands like a document that was meant to be read as well. Almost like they're leaving a record of the writing process as an important part of this like dossier that ends up being the Matrix. You know, in its complete form. Yeah, it's good. I'm gonna have to read that.
Voiceover. Is everything in place? On screen.
Yeah, that is voiceover.
Program.
Yeah, shit. Yeah, I should have said
Running.
that voiceover. For some reason, because I'm so used to the French, VO, version originale.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're right. Yeah, voiceover. It's bloody obvious.
Anyway.
All right. Yeah. Cool. Well, let's do something of that kind eventually. Like when we've got the houses in order, like a series of screenplay readings between me and you, Jacob as well, but like not to overload him.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, I've got all that stuff fixed. Sorry for like fucking up again.
That's all right, mate.
And there's closing moments and pissing you off, but anyway.
You don't.
All right, live and learn, yeah?
There is always next week.
Yeah, live and learn.
All right, big love, bro.
All right, cool. See you later.
Safe.